A long time ago, there was a famous blacksmith who lived in the area. He owned his own shop and sold equipment that was all handmade. One day, he was fortunate enough to start selling everything he produced to the kingdom of Cairo. Amidst an endless war, that was the perfect opportunity for him to elevate his status. With the end of the conflict, this same blacksmith was granted the title of Baron. And this man is the owner of these lands and the father of the young master Romain, who is the protagonist of this story. We see an old man telling this story to a seated boy. Meanwhile, a mustached man standing behind them wonders why the boy is paying so much attention to something that everyone already knows. However, the story then takes us back a few hours. The young man asks if he is the eldest son of the Dmitri family, if they are in the kingdom of Cairo on the Salamander continent, and if the Marim world really doesn't exist. The mustached man affirms this while thinking that the young man has always been odd, but today he really seems out of his mind. Perhaps he's been using some of those strange drugs that have become popular among the rich these days. The mustached man then mentions that a young lady from the Lawrence family is coming to visit them. But as he says this, he reflects on how the young man has been wasting his life over the past 25 years. That's why he's known as the Dmitri family's trash. The man tries to explain the importance and values of the girl, but Dmitri interrupts him, saying there's something more important. He asks for the oldest person in these lands to be brought to him, someone much more important than this young lady, because he needs to learn how to live in this current world. The mustached man is confused as to why a 25-year-old would say something like that, but as a servant, all he can do is obey. The story then returns to the present. The old man says that's all he knows about these places. Dmitri thanks him and says he will give him a reward, but the old man simply responds that it was an honor to speak with the young master. Now Dmitri knows that everyone knows him as Roman Dmitri. However, his true name is Bak Jong-kuk. He's a person from the Marim world who lived a life of wars, conquered everything he wanted, and died in peace at the end. But for some strange reason, he woke up in this body. He doesn't know if this is the will of the heavens or a punishment for not accepting ascension. Suddenly, they hear a noise outside and someone yells for a bastard. A boy gets kicked in the face while everyone watches. Surrounded by thugs in front of a small shop, he bleeds and can't respond, while the men keep calling him a filthy bastard and continue to beat him mercilessly. Dmitri's servant approaches to take a look, but is immediately shocked. He recognizes that red fang tattoo all too well. Beside him, someone asks what's going on. Dmitri orders him to answer quickly. The servant explains that these are the Blood Fangs, a group known not only in Dmitri's territory but also in the nearby regions. It seems the boy on the ground owes them something. The servant tries to tell Dmitri not to get involved because it will only cause trouble. However, the young man has already disappeared from his side and orders the thugs to stop. As Dmitri calmly approaches, the servant desperately tells him not to do anything. But Dmitri continues to walk forward. A bald man appears, recognizes Dmitri, and laughs in his face, warning him to stay out of it and not to think he has any authority just because he's of noble birth. Everyone says it's better if he doesn't interfere because it's none of his business. The servant continues to insist that they won't gain anything by going against the Blood Fangs. But Dmitri simply calls for Hans. He doesn't know the rules of this place, so he wants an explanation. Who broke the rules of this land and who should be punished? Hans hesitates for a moment, swallowing hard with fear before speaking. He says that if the boy really is in debt and didn't pay, he is guilty. However, the Blood Fangs don't have permission to punish someone like this. Worse still, they disrespected the eldest son of the Dmitri family, which in itself is a crime punishable by death. According to the rules of this place, it wouldn't be strange if they were executed for this. The thugs just stare, while Hans wonders if he should have said that. Dmitri then asks if they heard the explanation. He picks up a stick from the ground and declares that as the eldest son of the Dmitri family, he will have to punish them all. The bald man tries to explain that Dmitri is a noble and doesn't understand how the world works. He tells him to look at their shoulder tattoos and warns that if he continues acting like this, everyone will be in a difficult situation. Dmitri only says that this proves what he wanted to know. The bald man, now confident, asks what Dmitri is talking about. The young man explains that from what he can tell, they are nothing but trash since they speak this way about the lord of this land. He advances, saying that he doesn't care about the reputation they have in this place. The thugs are taken aback because they didn't expect the boy to actually attack like that. But now he will have to defend the honor of the Blood Fangs. And he slashes at Dmitri's neck. However, he immediately feels something strange. Dmitri had already plunged that branch into him. Without hesitation, Dmitri pulls it out and turns toward the other two thugs, but they only curse him, calling him a bastard and vowing to take revenge for their leader. Hans warns Dmitri to be careful, pointing out that the thugs are far better armed than he is. Yet Dmitri easily dodges their attack. He lands a swift kick to one thug's shin and follows it up with a punch to the face. The servant is bewildered. He had no idea that the young master could fight like this. To him, it doesn't even make sense that this could be the same Master Roman. The first thing Beck saw when he opened his eyes was a farewell letter on the floor and scattered drugs. The kingdom of Cairo, always at war, had to choose a representative from each of its noble houses to serve in the army. Roman was chosen to be his family's representative. However, he chose to take his own life instead. Beck reflects that it was a pathetic life, regardless of what Roman went through. But the current owner of this body is the leader of the celestial demon sect, and now he will live as he pleases. And boy, with just a stick, he painted the entire town red. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to censor this part because the boy is just too cruel. Behind him, someone calls him a monster. One of the last remaining Bloodfangs tries to flee, but Dmitri grabs him by the hair, slams him to the ground, and declares that the law must be obeyed. He warns that this last one will be allowed to live as a warning of what happens when the law is disobeyed. He gathers everyone in the town and declares that his name is Roman Dmitri. If anyone disagrees with the punishment he has dealt to these people, they can come find him at any time. Back Jong-hyuk. He reached the pinnacle of the Mirim world with incomparable strength. Hundreds of thousands of martial artists were defeated and massacred by him. When the blood of his enemies formed a river, everyone recognized that the celestial demon sect controlled the Mirim world. But now in this moment he has to exert himself just to deal with street rats. He calls for Hans and instructs him to notify the guards about everything that happened and to have someone clean up the place. The servant simply replies that he will do it immediately and runs off. Dmitri reflects on how weak and useless this body he inhabits is. He needs to accelerate his efforts to gather information on how to strengthen himself. Just then, the boy he had saved earlier gets up and thanks him for saving his life. Dmitri remembers that this was the boy who was being beaten but tells him that what he did was not intended to help him. The Bloodfangs broke the law and were punished, and that's all. Now the boy will have to explain his situation if he wants to keep his tongue. The poor boy, having just tried to express his gratitude, receives a threat instead. However, he says he will explain. His relatives borrowed money from the Bloodfangs to complete the purchase of some land and start farming. They would have easily been able to repay the amount they borrowed by selling their crops. But the damn Bloodfangs went to the land and destroyed all the crops so that they couldn't pay back the debt. Only later did the boy discover that they did this to blackmail his family and take his younger sister. The boy screams that the world isn't fair because even though they didn't have much, they never harmed anyone. The only thing he begs for is for Dmitri to save his sister. But Beck just observes the boy's eyes. That look reminds him of the Mad Demon, one of the 4 superior kings and someone he also met in a place as wretched as this. He then asks the boy his name, to which he replies, Kevin. With that, Roman says he will look into the situation and take care of everything. The boy shouts his thanks, while Dmitri senses that he will have a long relationship with this boy. The scene shifts to a carriage approaching. Someone inside informs Miss Flora that they are nearing the Dmitri estate. The blonde sighs, saying she understands. It seems she will have to meet this Roman Dmitri. A month earlier, someone shouted in a castle, demanding to know why there is an arranged marriage with the Dmitri family. Her father tries to remind her that their lands have been in terrible condition due to the ongoing war. However, Flora is confused, questioning whether the marriage was decided this way, and worst of all, it's with the Dmitris, a family full of old miners and a bunch of blacksmiths. She tries to explain something, but her father interrupts, saying all he can do is apologize for being so pathetic. Back in the present, the man in the carriage announces that they've arrived. Flora had hoped that at least the marriage would be with the second son, who seemed to have a promising future. But even that was ruined because Roman himself begged his father for her hand in marriage. She knows very well the reputation this man has for living a life of luxury and pleasure, and now she doesn't understand why they drenched him in so much perfume. As she walks through the corridors, she thinks that no matter how much her father needs this, she won't accept it, and she needs to make that clear. At that moment, she turns to Dmitri and says she wants him to forget about this marriage. Radiantly, he replies that it's indeed a great idea. At this point, the poor girl is utterly confused. Dmitri explains that he thought better about this marriage and realized it's foolish for someone as amazing as her to marry the idiot of the Dmitri family. Flora is left bewildered, wondering if he's being serious. He then tells her that something very important has come up and he needs to speak with his father immediately. However, she stops him, asking what's going on. She had heard that this marriage was only happening because he asked his father for it, but now he's suddenly canceling it without hesitation, which leaves her perplexed. Dmitri simply asks her if she really wants to marry him, and when she replies no, he tells her that in that case, they no longer need to cause problems for each other, and he'll take care of everything. He reassures her that she doesn't need to worry because he will take full responsibility. Since he's already called the idiot of the Dmitri family, he doesn't mind being called the divorced one as well. She can't understand why he seems so determined. Is this really the same idiot everyone talks about? The door then closes behind him, and from inside, she hears a heated argument. Someone yells, asking what's the meaning of canceling this marriage. However, Dmitri calmly informs his father that he's just letting him know because he's already told the girl. His father calls him an idiot, pointing out that everyone already calls him the fool of the Dmitri family, and what he was trying to do was secure a good relationship for the boy. It was the only thing he needed to do, as it would guarantee noble status for their family. All Dmitri had to do was marry a beautiful girl whom he himself had begged for. Dmitri apologizes, but his father grabs something from the table and throws it at his head, demanding to know if he thinks an apology will fix this. He had been planning to do something about sending him to the battlefield for the next 6 months, but now that seems inevitable, and he asks if Dmitri has anything to say. Dmitri simply replies that he has nothing to add. His father then mentions that he heard Dmitri got involved with the Bloodfangs and even punished them, but he doesn't believe it. He should know that even he can't go against that group. So now Dmitri will have to deal with his own problems. His father won't help him at all. Watching the boy remain silent, his father expects him to kneel and start crying, but Dmitri just responds that he understands and will handle everything on his own. Confused, his father stands up and asks what he means. But Dmitri simply says that the problem was caused by his actions, so he will resolve it and only return once everything is fixed. With that, he closes the door and begins to clean his face. Someone nearby asks if he's going crazy. Dmitri turns to see Flora and questions why she's still there. She tries to warn him that he's going against the Bloodfangs, who don't even fear nobles. If they see him as a threat, they'll probably kill him. She advises him to return to his father, beg for forgiveness, and give up on this. But Dmitri only asks why he would do such a thing. She explains the reasons, but Dmitri interrupts her, stating that it seems she really doesn't know her place. The scene shifts to a few hours earlier when Hans was dousing Dmitri with perfume to try to mask the smell of blood, and Dmitri was eager to take off the tight-fitting clothes. However, the servant explained that this was the only way to show respect. But Dmitri was thinking about this marriage. He's still adjusting to this world, and this would only complicate his understanding. The servant suggested they go downstairs to handle the situation. Dmitri thought that since the girl had never done anything against him, he had no reason to disrespect her, which is why he intended to end things with as little offense as possible. But now he realizes that the girl never planned to show him any respect in the first place, which gives him no reason to do so either. He then tells her that from his perspective, she seems very arrogant. However, it's ridiculous for her to show concern now when she didn't consider any circumstances while trying to break off the marriage. But when he told his father that he would take full responsibility, that's when she got anxious. He accuses her of wanting to appear like a good person after putting him in this situation. But she needs to understand that at no point did she interfere with his decision. They will now go their separate ways and each will take care of their own lives. He told his father that he would take full responsibility to prevent people from thinking that this was a consequence of the end of their relationship and because he wanted no further involvement with her. This was the first and last time they would see each other. Later that same night, someone tells another to stop drinking. It's Lehanna, Dmitri's mother. His father confesses that today, unfortunately, he used violence against Roman again. This is because after becoming nobles, he never wanted his son to go through that situation again. Lehanna tries to reassure him, saying it's alright and that their children have grown up healthy. The father acknowledges this, but admits that he still doesn't understand why the boy is like this, especially since Roman was the only one who went through hard times with him. He's at a loss for how to handle Roman. Lehanna tells him it's okay. They may have made mistakes as parents, but that's part of life. Yet, even so, they are still the only ones who can correct the boy's wrong behavior. Lehanna expresses confidence that the Romero she once knew will help their son get back on the right path. Her husband asks if she's referring to the issue with the Bloodfangs. She nods, saying she surely spoke out of anger, but since he can be a bit headstrong, it might be wise to talk to Captain Jonathan to help the boy out. He then calls for the servant and instructs him to summon Captain Jonathan. The next morning, Roman is walking through the town and Hans is trying to stop him, warning him that the Bloodfangs will likely try to take revenge for what happened yesterday. But Roman simply asks when Hans thinks these men became so powerful. Hans admits he has no idea. Roman explains that in war, fame is what generates fear. Because the Bloodfangs are ruthless, that fear has made them more efficient at completing their missions. Hans then asks if Roman is saying they aren't dangerous or that they are weak. Roman responds that they are only as weak as the amount of fear they can instill in him. The scene shifts to a restaurant where someone delivers a feast they had ordered. Hans is delighted, saying the food looks delicious. However, Roman stands up and says he's going out, but instructs Hans to stay behind, telling him that he'll continue the investigation, but that it would be too dangerous for Hans to accompany him. Hans jumps up, desperately insisting that he cannot allow something like that. Even if it means putting himself in danger, he must remain by the young master's side. Roman pauses for a second and then asks Hans if he really considers himself one of his men. Hans confirms, saying he will always follow the young master. Roman then tells him that he'll withdraw because he can't afford to lose someone as valuable as Hans in such a foolish way and reassures him that he'll be back soon. The poor Hans is left standing there, unsure of what to say but somewhat touched by the boy's words. As Hans runs off, he mutters that now is not the time to dwell on such things. He needs to inform others about this. Roman has realized over the past few days that the Bloodfangs aren't as strong as they seem. The problem is that because they operate in various small groups, it's difficult to eliminate the entire organization. They won't want to punish him publicly, and he can't locate them easily. But if that's the case, he just needs to make them come to him. That's why he deliberately walked through the city with Hans. Besides, today is a Dmitri Knight's training day, so the streets aren't heavily patrolled. This means that if they plan to seek revenge, this is the perfect opportunity. At that moment, a few men call out to Roman Dmitri from behind, and one of them jumps forward, declaring that this is their revenge and that he will pay the price for getting involved with the Bloodfangs. But then someone calls for the captain. A man with messy hair turns around. It's Hans, running towards Jonathan, calling out his name. Jonathan approaches the servant, asking why he's so frantic. Struggling to catch his breath, Hans tries to explain what's happening with Dmitri and urges Jonathan to find the boy immediately because he's in danger. However, Roman effortlessly dodges the first attack, lands an elbow in the attacker's stomach, making him drop his dagger, and then catches it midair with his other hand. Before the man can react, he's already been struck. Everything happened too fast, and the man retreated, unsure of what had just occurred. The other thugs, seeing their comrade fall, are equally confused. This Dmitri was entirely different from the one they'd heard about. Ronan simply asks what they're doing and invites everyone to come in at once. Back with the soldiers, Hans is frantically explaining the situation with the Bloodfangs. The soldiers exchange glances, saying it doesn't make any sense for Dmitri to be taking down the Bloodfangs. Hans insists that it's true, and that the boy has now gone up against all of them, making it very dangerous for them to just stand by. Jonathan recalls Romero mentioning all of this and asking for help. He just wants to know why Dmitri, who doesn't even know how to hold a sword properly, is getting involved in such matters. But he gathers everyone and tells them to grab their weapons, warning that they can't let anyone harm the young master. However, he'll be furious if the boy has actually caused trouble with the Bloodfangs. But the poor Bloodfangs were already on the ground. They attacked Dmitri, calling him a bastard, but he easily ducked under one swing and jabbed another in the stomach. Another bald man tried to come at him from the side, but Dmitri simply dodged and landed a kick to his belly. The fool collapsed, and Dmitri asked if it was just the three of them. The man tried to threaten him, saying he wouldn't get away with killing the two of them, but Roman just laughed, asking if he didn't realize that three of them would die. Roman then lightly stroked the man's thigh, telling him that it would be best to answer his questions, starting with who their leader was. The scene shifts to another part of town at the same bar from earlier. Suddenly, everyone inside is startled as Roman returns. The bald man at the counter turns to welcome him. He greets the young master, who responds with a cheery wave. The man wonders why Roman is acting so strange today and why he's even there. The bartender decided to ignore Roman's odd behavior and asked what he wanted to drink. Roman asked for a Tear of the Dawn. The bartender explained that they didn't serve such a drink there and asked if he wanted something else. Dmitri then requested the strongest drink they had because he had something to take care of in the morning. Earlier, someone had mentioned that everything was connected to the Dew of the Dawn at a bar in the middle of the city where they took on all their missions. All they needed to do was pass the special code. Roman asked what that code was, and the man had given him the exact code Dmitri had just used. At that moment, everyone fell silent. The bartender called out to the others in the bar, and just as he was about to give the order to attack, he was struck in the face. Everyone was shocked that the young man would do something like that in front of everyone, and they got up, shouting to kill him. Meanwhile, the townsfolk fled the bar to call the guards, but it was a quick strike to the back of one's neck and a chokehold for the others. A bunch of men were on the ground, bewildered, wondering what had just happened. The so-called idiot of the Dmitri family had taken down 3 people before they could even register what was going on. In the world of Murim, the strongest aspect is that one can strengthen themselves with breathing techniques. In a short time, Bake had managed to improve Dmitri's body. Of course, he was far from what he used to be, but these men no longer pose any threat to him. A little later, the bartender began to get up, trying to understand what had happened. Ronan commented that he had gotten up just in time, as he was about to finish everything. The bartender, a chubby man, asked why Roman was attacking their establishment. Dmitri called him an idiot, pointing out that he knew the bartender had sent the men to attack him. However, there were some things he was very curious about, so they would need to have a little chat. Sometime later, Jonathan arrived at the scene and questioned whether this was really something the young master had done. At that moment, a soldier appeared on the second floor, informing Jonathan that it seemed the young master had gone to the Lawrence estate. Jonathan was confused and wondered why. The soldier reported that it appeared the base of the Bloodfangs was located there. An hour earlier, Dmitri had told the bartender that it would be better if he confessed everything immediately. At this rate, he would be running out of fingers before he told the truth. The bald man warned that he had nothing to say to the boy, that Dmitri might kill him, but the Bloodfangs would take revenge. Roman then smiled, saying that now he liked the man's attitude. The people who resist the most before telling the truth are the ones he enjoys making talk the most. The old man commented that it was a waste and urged Roman to kill him already, but Roman responded that this was what they were there to find out. He then stated that it was time to resolve this and that he would need to test whether the man really wouldn't say anything. Roman held up a photo of the man with the boy beside him and asked what would happen if, by chance, he found the boy in the photo and killed him. The bald man claimed that wasn't his son, so it didn't matter. But Roman remarked that he was a terrible liar since the boy was the spitting image of his father. The man cursed at Roman, asking how a noble could dare use family as a threat. Roman replied that he had learned that the Blood Fangs members often sacrificed their lives for revenge because the group itself usually corrupted people by using their families. They used debts and threats to corrupt others as well, and Roman believed that the easiest way to make someone do what you want is to use their family. The bartender insisted that it didn't matter even if Roman knew the truth, the Blood Fangs would still kill him. Roman warned him to be more careful when deciding where to place his bets. He was serious when he said he would kill the man's son, and it was a vow he would make in his name. But before sending the soldiers to hunt down the boy, he would give the man one last chance to tell the truth. Now he had to choose whether to bet on the Blood Fangs and watch his son suffer, or bet on Dmitri and let him take care of the men. But the choice was his. The scene shifted to a house in the middle of an alley. Someone asked if it was really true. The man confirmed that the entire division in the middle of the city had been wiped out by Roman alone, and if the knights got involved, it would truly be in danger. A grizzled old man with a resemblance to Wolverine remarked that he hadn't expected the boy to have such courage. But it didn't make sense for an entire division to be killed by a boy who had been rejected by the Swordsmanship Academy. The man asked where Roman was, and the other replied that he had just left the Dmitri region. He asked if the boy was alone, and the answer was yes. The man commented that it was good, as it seemed Roman intended to attack the entire place by himself. He then ordered everyone in the group to gather with the goal of killing Roman before they had to face the Dmitri Knights. After that, they would stretch the boy's body out in the town so that everyone would know what happens when you go against the Blood Fangs, thereby reviving their infamy. The scene then shifted to another castle. Someone asked what the Barco family was up to. It was a meeting of elders, and they were discussing how that family had borrowed a lot of money, which likely meant they were preparing for a war. And if that was the case, they would need to consolidate their forces before these men grew stronger. The blonde man remarked that it seemed war would be inevitable, something he never expected to happen. A bespectacled man added that the central government also appeared to be supporting the Barcos. The old man in the red suit slammed his fist on the table, declaring that they couldn't afford to lose any territory since the Lawrence family relied entirely on fertile land. Another tried to argue that the documents proved past debts, but the man dismissed this as lies. Someone interrupted the discussion, telling everyone to be quiet. The blonde man emphasized that they couldn't give up the territory, or they would lose the rest to all the other families. Since the Barcos wanted to oppose them, they would have to resist with all their might. That's why they had arranged the marriage with the Dmitri family. The men smiled, agreeing that the Dmitris were indeed wealthy and that their weapons were top-notch. No matter how much money the Barcos borrowed, they would never have more wealth than the Dmitris. The father reiterated that this was why he had pushed his daughter to marry that idiot, as he surely wouldn't refuse her. Another man reassured him that he couldn't blame himself as a father, as it was the best choice for everyone. Outside, someone had been eavesdropping, Flora. Now she had no idea how she would break the news to her father. She couldn't imagine his reaction when he discovered she hadn't agreed to the marriage. But she also couldn't accept that her entire life would be sold to a man like that. The problem was that this wasn't just her father's plan, it was also the future of her family. But no matter what, she decided she would speak the truth. As she steeled herself to explain that she wouldn't marry someone she had no feelings for, a man arrived, urgently calling for the Lord. She turned confused. The man greeted Flora and then approached the door, calling for the Lord, shouting that it was an emergency. Flora was left utterly perplexed. Meanwhile, elsewhere, someone was pounding on a door, demanding that a bastard open it. It was Jonathan trying to enter the Lawrence territory, but the guard insisted that he follow the proper procedures. Jonathan warned that if Roman was harmed because of the delay, they would pay the price. At that moment, another man arrived at the gate, informing the captain that they were facing trouble. It seemed the Lawrence Square was also in chaos. Jonathan feared the worst and threatened to break down the door if they didn't open it. Back at the square, people were terrified by what was happening. Someone was hanging, and they were unsure whether they should intervene. It was the old Wolverine figure begging for someone to spare his life. He had been confident that defeating a single noble idiot would be simple. All they needed was anyone from the gang to handle it. But in reality, they had multiple armed men. He had been sure there was no way they could lose, or at least that's what he had believed. That is, until he saw everyone dead in front of him. Then he knew he was going to die too. He began to stumble over his words, pleading not to be killed, terrified of losing his life. Stuttering, he begged for mercy, grabbing Roman's leg and asking not to be killed. But Roman simply threw him into the middle of the city in front of everyone. The man pleaded, saying that if they spared him, he would serve as a dog for the rest of his life. Roman coldly responded that if he wanted to offer to become a dog, he should have done so before showing his fangs. He then announced to the city that this man was the leader of the Blood Fangs, and everyone knew the kind of person he was. They had threatened the Dmitri family and used dirty tricks to deceive people. The crimes committed by this organization were clear, and Roman declared that he would destroy the entire organization along with the evil they had spread. As the crowd stood in shock, Jonathan approached the square, and the scene left him speechless. There was no need to describe what happened to the leader. The scene then shifted back to the earlier meeting where someone asked if it was true. A soldier confirmed that he had allowed Roman Dmitri to enter because he was the future husband of Miss Flora. However, half an hour later, Roman had appeared, dragging a man through the middle of the city, claiming he was the leader of the Blood Fangs and executed him in front of everyone. The father was left speechless, and everyone else questioned whether this made any sense. The bespectacled man pointed out that killing and punishing someone without the Lord's permission was something that couldn't be ignored. However, the Lord was not overly concerned with the series of problems that were emerging. He was more curious about the fact that the man who was to become his son-in-law had single-handedly wiped out the Blood Fangs. He then ordered that Roman Dmitri be summoned, as he wanted to speak with the boy himself. Sometime later, Roman was escorted in along with the man who had let him in and Jonathan. As a renowned knight, Flora's father immediately recognized Jonathan, which led him to believe that Roman had only managed to defeat the Blood Fangs with Jonathan's help. The eldest son of the Dmitri family then introduced himself. The father decided to ignore the explanations and directly asked why Roman had done something so violent. Roman explained that a few days ago, the Blood Fangs had committed a crime and beaten an innocent citizen. That's when he executed everyone in that very place. Outside, Flora was trying to eavesdrop on the meeting. She called a knight over and asked him to come closer. She questioned if he had really taken Roman Dmitri inside, and he confirmed it. She then asked why Roman had gone to her father's room. The knight hinted that she might be one of the last to find out, which understandably left her alarmed. Back in the meeting, Roman continued, explaining that was why he had to invade the Blood Fangs base and kill their leader. That was the summary of everything that had happened. However, the Lord pointed out that Roman didn't have the authority to execute someone on Lawrence land. Roman acknowledged this but doubted their ability to handle such men, given that the Blood Fangs were infamous in the region, abusing the local citizens while nothing was done about it. That's why he took matters into his own hands, because he couldn't trust the Lawrence family to do it. The two servants on either side were shocked and drew their attention to Roman. But Roman expressed disappointment, saying he had expected to be called here for praise for doing the job they had ignored. He then asked the Baron if what he had done was truly wrong. The Baron asked the man beside him if he knew about Ben Miles. The man responded that they were aware he wasn't a good citizen, but they never imagined he was the leader of the Blood Fangs. At that moment, the Lord concluded that was enough, deciding there was no point in continuing the discussion since it wouldn't have been a problem if the Lawrence family had taken care of the man themselves. He then said he would reward the boy and allowed him to leave. With that, Roman departed. The room fell silent, broken only by the Lord's laughter. The man beside him even wondered if the Lord had gone mad. The Lord seemed impressed, never having imagined that this was the true Roman Dmitri. The advisor attempted to argue that they couldn't leave such actions unpunished, but the father dismissed his concerns, saying that it was fine since Roman was going to be Flora's husband. He knew that only someone with such courage could achieve great things. The advisor tried to continue, but the father cut him off, saying he didn't want to hear any more and was pleased that the boy was perfect for his daughter. He then ordered Flora to be brought in so he could discuss everything with her. Meanwhile, on the way back to Dmitri territory, Jonathan remarked that Roman shouldn't have told the whole truth because even though they had gotten rid of the Blood Fangs, a lord seemed to have been left angered. But Roman simply replied that all he did was show that the situation had escalated due to their negligence. And since the Lord still didn't know about the canceled marriage, he wouldn't punish his daughter's husband. Jonathan quickly realized that Roman had planned everything, leaving him puzzled as to who this person before him really was. It was clear he was no longer the Roman Dmitri they once knew. A voice echoed in Roman's mind, calling him by his true name, Bak Jong-hyuk, and reminding him that, as the son of the celestial demon, he would have to prove he was qualified to succeed him. First, he would have to survive hunger, cold, and the hard ground. But his father had warned that if he died, it wouldn't matter since he could simply have another son. The only way to prove his worth was to rule over everyone. Of course, Bak had already been beaten down. A chubby kid laughed, saying he thought Bak would be stronger as the son of the celestial demon. But in the end, he was just an arrogant brat. Bak stood up only to be struck in the face again. The poor boy couldn't do anything. The other children, who stayed out of it, just thought he was an idiot. While most children were protected by their families during childhood, Bak had been forced to live in a world where only the strong survived. Back in Dmitri territory, Roman was now relaxing in a bathtub, enjoying a peaceful bath. He couldn't believe how exhausted his body had become from such a simple task. However, it was undeniable that since waking up in this world, he had experienced many things. To defeat the Blood Fangs, he had to kill everyone who stood in his way. Yet he had no regrets, as it proved that he hadn't changed as a person. If necessary, he would torture those who crossed him and eliminate anyone who sought to end his life. This was the life he had always lived, and nothing would change just because he had become Roman. The only problem was that it was becoming increasingly dangerous to go out as he had, and he didn't fully understand how this world operated. Not to mention, his true strength had diminished significantly, and he would need to think carefully about how to act in the future. Suddenly, someone called for the young master from the door, informing him that the Lord wished to speak with him. In the room, Romero asked if the boy had really done all that. Jonathan confirmed it, noting that Roman had changed a great deal. The father remained curious, but the knight insisted that this young master was not the same person they knew. Romero admitted that Roman had always been his greatest challenge. the only son with no notable characteristics, yet the only one who had endured the hardships when they were poor. A long time ago, Roman had handed his father a candy. When asked what it was, the boy had simply replied, "It's a sweet." Romero was working in the mines when he saw his son approaching and asked why he had come to such a dangerous place, reminding him that it wasn't safe. But the boy just smiled and said that his father worked too much, so he brought him a sweet to give him energy to work faster and come home sooner. All Romero ever wanted was for his son to be happy. That's why he always favored him and gave him money so he wouldn't be called poor. He never imagined that this would lead Roman down the wrong path. Part of him had already given up on the boy, but hearing that he had taken down the blood fangs filled him with a renewed sense of hope. At the door, Roman asked to enter. Romero thought to himself that regardless of how Roman had achieved it, he had managed to eliminate the blood fangs. If that was the case, he was ready to do anything for his son. This would be his excuse for having failed as a father before. When Roman entered, Romero remarked that he had heard that Roman had taken down the blood fangs by himself. Bake, now inhabiting Roman's body, observed the boy's father. He could see that the man was anxious and full of hope for what he was about to say. Buck knew that if he told the truth, he would be seen in a completely different light. The problem was that accomplishments beyond expectations always came with a price. If he downplayed things now, he might buy himself more time to develop further. As his father continued calling out to him, Bake debated whether to tell the truth or lie. Hiding the truth seemed the more rational decision. Bake's thoughts flashed back to when he was being beaten as a child. The bully taunted him, asking if that was all he had. Then Bake grabbed a rock from the ground and smashed it into the bully's face without mercy. The boy was badly hurt, falling to the ground, and Bake stood up, picking up another rock to finish him off. From that day on, everyone was afraid of him. That was when he learned that in a lonely world, the most powerful always reigns. He declared to everyone that the boy he had killed was the former leader of their group, meaning that now he was in charge. Demonstrating superiority was the only way to ensure total victory. That's why Bake, now Roman, decided to say, "Yes, I was the one who took down the blood fangs." He and the celestial demon didn't know how to hide their superiority. Sometime later in the city's training grounds, the young trainees were practicing their swordsmanship when someone ordered them to stop and show respect to the lord who had arrived. Everyone immediately bowed, and a blonde boy in the group looked surprised, wondering why Roman Dmitri was there. The trainer announced that they would be testing their swordsmanship against Mr. Roman and invited anyone who wanted to participate to step forward. Strangely, everyone was sweating, and no one wanted to volunteer. The blonde boy couldn't understand why everyone seemed so afraid of Roman, or more accurately, why anyone would want to fight the idiot. An hour earlier, when Roman had confessed to his father that he was indeed the one who had taken down the blood fangs, his father asked how he had managed to defeat them. Needing to avoid raising suspicion, Roman explained that he had been secretly practicing swordsmanship. His father asked why he had kept it hidden, assuring him that he would have given him all the support he needed. Roman replied that he was tired of wasting his life and wanted to prove that even the idiot of the Dmitri family could accomplish something on his own. However, Romero found it hard to believe, saying it was impossible for someone to learn swordsmanship on their own to the point of killing those men. Roman explained that the Blood Fangs maintained their operations through threats, which was why he set a trap to lure out their leader. His father asked how he did it, and Roman explained that the Blood Fangs always retaliated against weaker nobles, so he used himself as bait. Romero said it was very risky because if they sought revenge, it would be easy for them. But Roman explained that most of the members were kept in line through threats, and he knew that if he could kill the leader, no one would want to save someone who had threatened them. Romero thought to himself that it was an extremely well thought out plan, and Roman had shown a lot of courage to follow through with it. Impressive would be an understatement for what he had done. To think that Roman was capable of such a thing. His father then asked if he could request a favor, and Roman agreed. Romero said he wanted to see this swordsmanship that Roman had been practicing with his own eyes to understand how much he had changed. Now back at the training grounds, Romero was startled by the fact that no one was volunteering. The blonde boy thought that whoever hit Roman would be expelled, and whoever lost would also be expelled for being so bad, making no one want to participate. Meanwhile, Jonathan was thinking that they needed someone who could defeat Roman easily to demonstrate the knight's skills. He announced that if no one volunteered, he would choose someone himself. As the master, Jonathan couldn't participate, so there was only one other option. He called out the name Chris, telling the boy to step forward, which shocked him. Chris was the vice captain of the Dmitri Knights. The first time he had met Roman was the previous year, when they had gone to a bar where people were complaining about a drunk causing trouble. There, they found someone shouting and demanding to know if they were trying to make a fool of him. The boy had asked if they really wanted to shut down the place. The attendants apologized and didn't quite know what to do. However, it was the drunken Roman who said that trash like them shouldn't even speak, and he ordered the guy to come over to him once again. They tried to say something, but he threw the bottle against the wall. That's when Chris told the boy that enough was enough, but he just asked who they were. Chris reached out to grab his wrist to get him out of there, telling him he was embarrassing himself, but he received a slap in the face. And Roman asked how a lowly knight like him had the courage to lay his hands on him. Well, with just that slap, Chris already knew that this boy had never trained a day in his life. His strength was at best below the average of a man. He felt sorry for the Lord for having a son like that guy, and he was absolutely certain that this was trash, better off dead. So why were they telling him to have a duel with this Roman? He tried to tell the captain that he didn't think it was a good idea and that there might be other more suitable people for it. However, Jonathan warned that the boy had taken down the blood prisoners, so it had to be him. Chris was about to say something, but Jonathan just cut him off. So he said he understood. Everyone was eager to see the duel, and the two calmly observed each other. Jonathan told them to wait, but at that moment, Chris said he had a request. He warned that he had a vow to be merciless in a duel, regardless of who it was. If they accepted this request, he would then participate in it. He was certain that this idiot wasn't the person who had defeated the blood prisoners. Jonathan and Romero seemed to agree, and Roman, of course, smiled, which did not make Chris happy at all. Jonathan said that by the laugh, the boy had accepted, and then he told both sides to get ready. While Chris was consumed by anger, Roman was just smirking. The second Jonathan gave the signal, Chris immediately launched himself, while the boy stood still, waiting for him. He quickly observed one of the movements, and Chris delivered a full strike that the boy defended against. The people who trained with Chris immediately realized that he was giving it his all. However, Jonathan was already impressed. The boy had actually blocked it. Chris retreated immediately. He could tell the boy's strength just by the way he defended himself. Not to mention that his stance still seemed completely stable. It wasn't exactly how he expected this duel to go, but he didn't care about that. He would only be satisfied when he crushed this guy. He tried another slash, but Roman simply sidestepped. However, Chris saw this movement. He spun his body to hit him from the side, but the boy defended again. Roman seemed calm, observing the attacks. When Chris found an opening at his back, for him the match was won now. It was just a matter of landing this blow and it would be over. But Roman simply crouched. He saw an opening, and at that moment, Chris knew he was going to get hit. The attack brushed past his face, and the guy even got a new haircut. Terrified, he retreated. He realized how dangerous that had been, while the Lord and the captain couldn't believe it. For the people who trained with Chris, it made no sense that he was losing, and he himself wondered if this was really the skills of Roman Mitri that he knew. From defense to evasion or attack, nothing was lacking. Could it be that he had really defeated the blood prisoners? Because if so, at this pace, at that moment he said he was overthinking and Roman was still the same idiot as before. But that's when Roman said that was enough warming up, and he said that this time he would go first. And the poor guy hadn't even reacted yet. Too late when he realized it. He managed to defend himself the last second by sheer luck. While he couldn't believe that the boy was that fast, he made a move backward, but Roman kept closing in. All Chris could do was defend bit by bit, and the people around were scared by this sequence of attacks. Chris was having to give it his all just to manage to defend himself. He had to at least find an opportunity to end this, but then he took a hit to the arm that knocked him sideways. He realized he needed to step back, but that's when he noticed Roman was coming at him with an overhead attack. The movement seemed long and slow, and the middle of his chest seemed like the perfect opening, and he didn't hesitate to strike with full force. But it was just a trap from Roman, who easily dodged. He gave a little smile, and at that moment, Chris realized he had fallen into a trap. He knew there was no way he could win at this rate, and the worst part was losing to Roman. That's when he gripped his sword, and an aura emerged from it. Jonathan shouted and told him to stop that. But Chris had already activated the one-star aura. Of course, even Bake was surprised by that, and the arena exploded. The people around couldn't see anything. Romero was worried about what might have happened to Roman. He let out a sigh of relief, realizing that Roman had narrowly avoided getting hit by that aura-infused sword. Chris, disoriented after accidentally using the aura, was promptly struck on the chin for his troubles. Naturally, neither Jonathan nor Romero expected Roman to win, but there was Chris, lying on the ground. Everyone always asked who this new young prodigy of the captain was. The others would respond that he was one of the best they had ever seen. Despite being so young, he was already a 2-star knight. Rumors circulated that he had started sensing mana after just 6 months of training and had reached 1 star in less than 3 years. Moreover, his swordsmanship was said to be incredible. The women were all curious, wanting to know the boy's name. After practice, Jonathan would often say that was enough for the day, but Chris would get up and ask to practice just one more time. That kind of determination excited Jonathan because the boy not only had talent, but also worked hard. To him, Chris was a genius. But there was his genius now being thoroughly beaten by Roman, who cruelly watched him lying on the ground. While Chris lay unconscious, Romero called out to Jonathan, asking what had happened, as he had heard that Chris was a 2-star knight. The problem was that not even Jonathan could grasp how strong Roman had become. What Roman had displayed was the skill of someone who should have had years of training. Considering that just a month ago he had been doing nothing but complaining, it seemed impossible that he had changed so much. But nothing made sense, so Jonathan simply told Romero that Roman was a genius in swordsmanship. Roman, meanwhile, was just laughing as he looked at Chris, who was still unconscious. He was impressed by how aggressive and focused Chris was. With the skill he had shown, Chris could easily have taken down the Blood Fangs as well. It was easy to see why Jonathan was proud to have him as a protege. But to the celestial demon, Chris was one of the weakest. Even the weakest warriors of the celestial demon sect were stronger than this. However, that strange power Chris had displayed at the end had really caught his attention. As another Joker started to emerge, Romero began laughing like a madman. Once again, everyone was confused. But of course, Romero said it was great to see this. To him, it was incredible to have a son who was a genius in swordsmanship. He asked Jonathan if he was sure. Jonathan replied that it was impossible for someone to have evolved so much without being a genius. Naturally, the father was all smiles. He called Roman over, telling him to come closer. Romero said it had been a long time since he had been this happy and that he wanted to applaud his son. To him, Roman deserved whatever he wanted, so he could ask for anything. Roman smiled and mentioned the war that was going to happen in 6 months. His father was already certain that Roman would ask not to go and asked what it was. However, Roman's request was the right to choose whoever he wanted to go with him. Romero was confused and even a bit stunned. He tried to suggest that Roman could return to Flora and back out of this, but Roman simply said that he wanted to go. This surprised his father, who then said he understood. Roman would have the right to take whoever he wanted to that war and anything related to it. Roman then said he had one more request, and his father told him that as long as he acted properly, he could ask for anything. Roman made his second request while looking at Chris, who was still unconscious. When Chris awoke, he asked why he had to teach Roman about aura. Jonathan simply replied that it was the master's order. However, Chris protested, saying this was too much. He didn't even know Roman, and after having been in a coma for so long, it was embarrassing. Now, on top of everything, he had to teach aura to this guy. He said he would rather have his head cut off. Jonathan interrupted and made a proposal. If Chris could use the opportunity of teaching Roman to learn why Roman had changed so much, he would gain the right to learn any technique Jonathan had been hiding from him. Immediately, Chris got up, excited, asking if it was true, and Jonathan confirmed it. Now Chris was eager because he was certain this would be easy, and he would definitely receive the secret to becoming a 3-star knight. Of course, he didn't want to seem too enthusiastic, but he told Jonathan to keep his word. Inside the castle, someone called out to Roman, saying they had heard about the incredible duel he had today. It was Hans who remarked how amazing it was that Roman had defeated a 2-star knight. Roman asked if he knew what this 2-star aura business was. Hans admitted he didn't know much but said it was related to the ability to use mana. Our protagonist then mused that it seemed to be called mana in this place. He was sure the power Chris had used was a key explosion, but the way they utilized it was completely different from how it was used in the mirror world. Here, it was called aura, and one detail he had noticed was that it was a total waste. Even though he didn't understand why they used ki in this way, he knew he needed to learn more about this power and how people utilized it. But during tomorrow's training, he was confident he would get the answers he needed. The next morning, Roman stood face to face with Chris, who was clearly not happy. However, Roman wasn't much different, until the boy let out a little chuckle, which immediately made Chris angry. He tried to calm himself down and said he would explain what aura was. He explained that aura was nothing more than the use of mana from a knight's perspective. Mages also use mana, but they create circles and spells to do so, while knights use it around their bodies. The first person to explore the use of mana was Emperor Alexander. He was the first to discover that it was possible to use mana to strengthen the body, and aura was the ability to release it instantly. This allowed someone to use much more strength than normal. However, Chris mentioned that the history wasn't very important since only a few people could use mana. 1 in 1,000 could become a knight, and 1 in 10,000 could become a mage. That's why discovering whether you have the affinity is the most important thing, as the minimum talent required to become a knight with aura is the ability to at least sense mana. He said that it took him half a year, but achieving it in a year was above average. Roman acknowledged this and asked Chris to explain how to sense this mana. Chris agreed while thinking that Roman was full of himself after winning that fight. However, it was a shame, as talent in swordsmanship and in mana were two completely different things. Now Roman would experience the harsh reality through this training. But the premise of this training was flawed from the start. Roman had already sensed the mana of this world, and using the techniques he learned as the celestial demon, he was storing part of it in the center of his body. He was only here to understand why they did things this way, even if it wasn't the right way. He wanted to comprehend why they did things this way. Chris started walking around and told Roman to feel everything that came into contact with his body. Once he got used to sensing the mana, he could start thinking about trying to manifest it. When he succeeded in manifesting it, he would become a 1-star knight. However, there were various ways to manifest aura. It could be applied to a sword or, for example, cover the body. He was about to continue his explanation when he noticed something. Roman was already standing beside him with his mana activated. Poor Chris didn't even know what to say. The boy was actually manifesting aura, but Roman could only think that he knew very well that the way people use ki in this world was garbage. In his world, you purify the energy and concentrate it within your body, whereas in this world, they simply expect mana to naturally accumulate in their bodies. In the Mirim world, mana is scarce and dense, meaning it's difficult to accumulate but also doesn't move much. Here, however, mana is abundant but extremely light, causing it to escape the body as easily as it enters. The two methods weren't even comparable since in Murim, you usually strengthen both the exterior and interior of your body. In this world, the exterior isn't strengthened and mana isn't accumulated. Not to mention that spreading energy everywhere is completely inefficient. If Roman used such a method, he wouldn't reach the top 10 even in 100 years. Shocked, Chris asked how Roman had done it. Roman replied that Chris probably already knew the answer. Chris insisted that this was exactly why he was asking, since it took him at least half a year. He demanded Roman tell the truth, accusing him of pretending not to know how to use mana just to show off now. It was starting to make sense why Chris had lost. Roman commented on Chris' assumption that he was hiding his powers, saying that Chris was just assuming what he wanted. But poor Chris was struggling to understand what was happening, knowing it took him 10 years to reach 2 stars. Suddenly, Roman started laughing and Chris asked what was so funny. Roman just remarked that Chris was amusing. Chris, now more upset, asked if Roman was saying that his efforts were funny. Roman then asked if, in all those 10 years of climbing the ranks, Chris had ever once questioned the methods he was being taught. Chris was about to respond, but Roman cut him off, saying that ordinary people are like that. They assume that what has been passed down through countless generations is always correct. When he was learning aura, he wondered why people were so fixated on this method when it clearly had flaws. Was it because they didn't know any better? Or was their faith in Captain Jonathan too strong? But the truth is, people follow it because it's the easiest thing to do. Ronan continued, saying he wouldn't deny that Chris had worked hard for 10 years, but he found it really funny that Chris had never questioned the purpose of what he was doing. Ronan then walked away, saying that nothing in this world reaches a perfect state. Even things he once held as certainties were different in the past and changed over time. Roman knew that questioning oneself like this leads to suffering, especially when, after countless attempts, you end up failing. That's when you have to go against everyone's criticism and your own despair. However, even if that's the case, change is necessary. That's how Roman ignored his father's teachings and created his own art. He then told Chris that they would end the training there. At that moment, Chris called out to Roman and asked him what he should do from now on. The scene shifted to a flashback. A man asked a boy if he was going to continue suffering or if he would admit defeat. From now on, the Blood Demon sect would follow Bake. The only thing the man wanted to know was how he could become as strong as Bak. He was determined to dedicate his body and soul to him as long as they both became stronger, but he needed to know what he should do from now on. Roman recognized this as someone who had let go of their pride and said that it was interesting. The Blood Demon was someone so powerful that he unified all the sects. As someone who dominated the Murim world, it was inevitable that he would eventually face Bak, and in the end, after a long battle, he was defeated. Roman remembered that the child from the past had swallowed his pride and asked for guidance. The desire to become stronger at the cost of one's pride reminded him of the Blood Demon. He told Chris that he was asking about ways to become stronger, but unfortunately, he didn't know what to say to that. Confused, Chris asked what he should do then. Ronan replied that he had already given the answer. The only thing he couldn't do was blindly follow what he had been taught. If Roman taught him anything, Chris would be following another lesson blindly. So what Chris needed to do was seek the answer on his own. The only hint Roman gave was to stay by his side from now on. In 6 months, Roman would go to the battlefield, where Chris would see him defeating countless enemies and becoming stronger. And if in 10 years Chris was still by Roman's side, Roman was sure that by then, Chris would have found the answer. That same night, Chris lay isolated in bed. He recalled everyone saying that the right thing to do was to train until he began to feel human. He remembered the teachings passed down to him by Jonathan, even the time when he was told he had become a 2-star knight. But Roman's laughter, mocking him for never questioning, filled him with anger. Someone asked what this was all about. Jonathan wanted to know if Chris was sure, as Chris had just said that he would go to the battlefield in 6 months with Roman. Jonathan asked if something had happened, and Chris confirmed that something had. They locked eyes for a moment, and the captain admitted that it seemed Chris had a reason for doing this. From now on, Chris would no longer be part of the Dmitri Knights. No matter what happened, Jonathan hoped that Chris could protect Roman on the battlefield. Chris simply thanked him. But at that moment, Jonathan realized that Chris was no longer the little boy he had found on the battlefield, desperately clinging to a dead woman. Jonathan said that if the Chris he knew really wanted to follow Roman, then it seemed that Roman was no longer an idiot. He told Chris to follow him, as from now on he would be prepared. If Chris wanted to survive on the battlefield, he would need a secret weapon that he could call his own. Now the knight was excited. The scene shifted to the city, where everyone was talking about a certain rumor that the idiot of the Dmitri family had wiped out all the Blood Fangs. Kevin, from the beginning of the story, was there listening to people saying that Roman had really kept his word. He believed it might be true, as he had seen Roman take down 3 men with just a stick in his hand. But could it really be that Roman did this because he had kept his word? Kevin concluded that no, Roman wouldn't go that far just for someone like him. At that moment, his boss asked why he was standing there thinking and told him to get back to work. Kevin thought about how all he wanted was to be strong enough to protect his family. He knew that there were still dozens of people like the Blood Fangs in the world. But as a peasant, how could he become stronger? Training wasn't an option, he wouldn't even get a chance. Just then, someone called out to him, causing the crate he was holding to fall to the ground. It was Roman, who said that it had been a while since they last saw each other. Kevin asked what Roman was doing there, but then quickly corrected himself and threw himself to the ground, thanking Roman for saving his family. Roman asked if things had improved, and Kevin confirmed that they had. The Bloodfangs were no longer pursuing them, and he had even found a job. The only thing Kevin didn't know was how to express his gratitude. Ronan told him not to worry because there would be an opportunity as soon as Kevin heard his proposal. His family would never have to worry about money again. Additionally, they would have a house and good food. They wouldn't need to work in exhausting places anymore. Kevin's entire family could be blessed with this new life, but the price was that Kevin would have to swear loyalty and live for Roman. Kevin was silent for a moment before he bowed his head to the ground, saying he would live for Roman. He would die if Roman asked and kill if Roman commanded. If Roman promised to take care of his family, that would be more than enough. Roman saw that Kevin was the kind of person who showed loyalty with his own blood. In his past life, the Mad Demon was someone who could wipe out entire clans with just one word. Maybe that's why as soon as he thought of summoning someone, Kevin's name came to mind. It was truly worth it to see the boy again, and Roman said that from this point forward, Kevin was his. Back at the Dumitry Castle, Roman handed Kevin over to Hans and asked him to help the boy adjust. Roman mentioned that he would return later, and Kevin expressed his gratitude for everything. With that, they left and Roman headed to the library. Roman began studying the path of the Aura Knights. The first stage was the manifestation, which qualified someone as a 1-star knight. To reach 2 stars, one would need to cut through steel with their aura. At 3 stars, one transcended logical comprehension and was treated as someone special in any kingdom. On the Salamandra continent, there were a few 6-star knights, but no one had ever heard of someone reaching the 7th rank. Even among the 10 strongest in the world, not all were 6-star knights. Roman mused that given Chris's strength, Jonathan must be a 3-star knight, and that 6 stars in this world were practically incomprehensible. The aura of someone like that could reach 12 meters in height and impact the entire world. Currently, there were only 12 6-star knights in the entire world. Roman realized that these individuals were indeed powerful, especially if they could achieve such feats in an inefficient way. On the other hand, there were the so-called Archmages, a title given to a sorcerer who reached 7 circles. In this world, they were considered half-god, half-human, as they could bring destruction wherever they went. A single spell from someone like that could split the sky in 2. Unfortunately, magic was something that didn't exist in the Mirim world, and now he at least had some idea about it. As unlikely as it was, he knew he couldn't afford to make an enemy of someone like that for the time being. The fact that he couldn't predict anything about them made everything more dangerous. But Roman wasn't someone who could live in a bubble. He enjoyed experiencing everything and reading overall. This would indeed be interesting. Now it was time to truly begin. The scene shifted to Hans opening a room. Roman asked what it was for. A servant explained that it was the old forge, and no one had access to that place anymore. Roman remarked that it was the perfect place to train. He told Hans that he would be staying there for the next week and that no one should enter or bring him food. Roman made Hans swear that unless his people were in grave danger, he wouldn't let anyone inside. Hesitantly, Hans agreed. With that, Roman was left alone. He noticed that the room was filled with straw because Hans had put it there to make things more comfortable. Roman appreciated the gesture but preferred to do without it. All these days, he had been accumulating energy in the center of his body, but it was time to start developing the techniques he used in his past life. He activated the first stage of the Celestial Demon's Arc. First, he would circulate all the energy to remove impurities from his body. The cultivation process was aggressive, with blood pouring out everywhere. Ronan knew this would happen, which is why he had accumulated the right amount of energy. He didn't have time to waste and needed to regain his past strength as quickly as possible. The first stage of this technique was called the Human Stage, and it was the first step toward his goal. The scene then shifted to a week later. A bald man offered to bring tea and drinks for Count Lawrence and Miss Flora. The Lawrence entered and asked where Roman was. The bald man explained that Roman was currently handling some business and then closed the door, leaving them inside. Lawrence remarked that it was clear they weren't welcome there. He told his daughter they would have to wait and instructed her to sit down. He then called her by name and explained that he had arranged this meeting to reverse the mistake she had made. Flora replied that she understood perfectly. Back in the moment when he had shouted upon discovering that she had broken off the engagement, Flora explained that she had already discussed her situation with Roman and even tried to follow her father's advice. But he interrupted her, calling her by name and reminding her that he had always believed she was an intelligent child, so he hadn't expected her to do something like this. She needed to understand that the Barco family had borrowed a large sum of money from the bank, which meant that a war would soon begin. The marriage with the Dumitry family wasn't just a decision. It was inevitable because they were the only family capable of standing against the Barcos in this region. Flora argued that the Lawrence family wasn't weak and questioned why they thought they couldn't win without the Dumitrys. Her father explained that the government had approved all the documents without even checking anything. And if the bank itself had lent so much money, it showed that this matter had already escalated beyond these families. This battle was designed for them to lose, and they would use that defeat to take everything they had. He would lose the land, the honor, and even her, who was known as the flower of the Lawrence family. In the present, Flora reflected that she knew all of this. She understood the decisions and why her father had made them. Yet she had ignored it all for selfish reasons. She needed to wake up to reality since she couldn't live like a flower forever. Meanwhile, Renzo was wandering around, wondering what he should do. As soon as Roman appeared, he would have to tell him that Flora had been waiting for him since the morning. The problem was that it was already late afternoon, but at the same time, Roman had also told him not to disturb him. Finally, the door opened. Renzo, all radiant, called out for the young master, but he was in for a shock. However, the scene shifts back to Lawrence. He already expected this treatment because of Flora's mistake. He knows that the Lawrences need this political marriage, but even so, this didn't sit right with him. Suddenly, he stands up and Flora calls out to him. He announces that he's going to sort this out and find Baron Dimitri on his own. Someone calmly takes a few notes. Then suddenly, Lawrence opens the door and asks why he's making a visit and waiting so long. If he's dissatisfied, he could have just said so. He never expected the Dimitris to be so petty. However, Romero is just standing there observing. He says he understands what he said, but asks if today's meeting was scheduled in advance. The Baron mentions that he understands that he showed up unannounced, but it's been a week since he's been asking to speak with Roman. If, at least, they had refused from the start, they wouldn't have been offended. However, Romero asks why he would refuse a visit from the Lawrences. But now, he wants to know if that's all he has to say, and if really he barged into this room to complain about being tired of waiting until noon. On the day Flora visited, Roman himself said he wanted to end that marriage. Even though they argued with the boy, he is sure Flora didn't want that marriage either. Even if it was a disgrace to the Dimitris, he decided to say nothing and stay quiet like a fool. After all, it was she who came there just to say it wouldn't work out. Even though, at the beginning of it all, it was the Lawrences who were pushing for it to happen. And now he's there, barging into the room and complaining just because he had to wait for a while. Even worse, for a meeting that wasn't even scheduled. And he has the nerve to complain as if it's his fault. He then reveals that not long ago he received a message from the Barcos. It was an offer for a political marriage where they would gain connections with the central government and a piece of the Lawrence's land. Even so, he decided to refuse that offer and asks him why he thinks he did that. Lawrence, who also questions this, wonders because to him, it would obviously be more advantageous to ally with the Barcos. Roman says the reason is simple. The Dimitris have enough power for him to choose whatever path he wants. And since his eldest son liked the young lady from the Lawrence family, that was the reason he opposed the Barcos. At that moment, Lawrence realizes he messed up because of his foolish ego. The father says he understands his son's reputation for being an idiot, and that the fame of the two doesn't match. But even so, he needs to keep in mind what kind of family they are. Roman's name completely changes the moment the Dimitri family is associated with him. And that's why those who should be desperate for this marriage aren't them, but in fact the Lawrence family. Or perhaps did he misunderstand something? Suddenly, Flora remembered the days she used to go to the academy when she was younger. That was the place where many children from renowned families went to build their knowledge as nobles. However, there was one family from the north that had only one person there. The boy was so quiet that one could question if he really existed. That was the son of the Joel family. In a place where the children believed they were treasures born into this world, he was distant. Until one day, he made a small mistake. For the other children, that wouldn't mean anything, even if they made big mistakes. However, in his case, it resulted in a disciplinary committee. And on the day the teacher scolded him, a father approached and apologized. He begged for his son to be forgiven and said he would teach him better. At that moment, from a distance, she could only think of one thing. She felt sorry for him. However, right now, all of this seems funny to her. The Viscount apologizes and says he has nothing to say. Meanwhile, Flora realizes she had no right to feel sorry for that boy. And the Viscount says his daughter made a mistake out of immaturity. At that time, Joel was weak, and this is the same case for the Lawrences today. Once again, the father apologizes, saying that his entrance was disrespectful, and Flora understood that the weak had no choice but to bow to the strong. It was then that she began to lean forward to apologize to Romero. However, at that moment, someone entered. From the door, they announced that Master Roman had arrived, and Flora realized she had learned this lesson too late. Roman had dyed his hair white, and he was all dark now. He entered the room and announced that Roman Dimitri greeted his father. Everyone was confused, and the father asked if he had finished his training. He said yes, so he replied that they could discuss it later. He was called there to discuss the marriage with the Lawrences. All of this had started because of a decision he made, so he would respect any choice he made. Roman quickly understood what he was trying to say. He knew the significance of the alliance between those two families. At this moment, when the Lawrences are in danger, the wealth of the Dimitris would serve as protection. The father asks if he requested this marriage even knowing that. Roman said that at the time he thought that was enough of a reason. However, everything changed when he met her for the first time, and she immediately talked about canceling the engagement. She had certainly heard the rumors and decided she wouldn't marry someone like him because of that. This means that all of her decisions were based on what others said. Regardless of how society judges them, he wants to be with someone who only believes in what they experience and see. and it is for this reason that he votes to end the engagement. At that moment, the room fell silent. Lawrence thought that now it was the end of everything, as this marriage was the last card they had. No other family would accept a political marriage in this situation. This means they would have to solve their problems with their own power. The problem is that if the Dimitris and the Barcos really combined forces, it wouldn't stand a chance. He needed to do something to at least prevent that. He then bowed and said that the Lawrences took full responsibility for this. As an apology, they would no longer collect any taxes from a Dimitri merchant passing through their territory. He knew this wasn't much for someone as wealthy as they were, but it was a way to show they were sorry. Romero said he couldn't accept that, as the Dimitris couldn't profit from his son's future. All they would need to do is announce that it was Flora who canceled, and they wouldn't join forces with the Barcos. Lawrence simply thanked him. Of all his fears, this was the greatest. And with that, they left the room. Not before he looked back just to see Dimitri standing there. If he had known the potential of this young man a little earlier, he would have been more assertive when he spoke with Flora. In the end, he too had made a big mistake. Romero then called Roman and asked what had happened to him in the past week. In that training, all he did was remove impure energy to advance the human state. This is the basis of the techniques he created, and it's nothing impressive in the Mirim world. The problem is that, since this place has abundant mana, it accumulated in the body, and the purification of something like that created a miraculous effect. From his outward appearance, like the skeletal changes, it was evident that he had become a different person. He then simply tells his father that he achieved an awakening on his own, and that this change occurred because he started to feel mana flowing through his body. Romero was startled since this was supposed to take years. He had heard of a natural phenomenon where mana starts to circulate, but it had happened to very few people. However, the boy was achieving one feat after another since he managed to take down the Blood Fangs. All of this defied logic, but he couldn't forget that the boy was still his son. Romero then said that regardless of the challenges he faced, he would not leave him alone. And the boy should never forget that his name is Roman Dimitri, because his father would always support him. At that moment, Baker recalled a flashback. On one of the days when he was being trained, his father always thought he was a pathetic bastard. The man in front of him wasn't cold or cruel. He didn't even push him to the brink of death. He then thanked Romero, while thinking that it wasn't so bad after all. When he left the room, someone called out to him. It was Flora, all awkward, not knowing what to say. She apologized for judging him so hastily and causing trouble for both families. He simply walked away, saying she didn't need to apologize. After all, he hadn't planned on accepting it from the beginning. She continued, saying that she understood he didn't like it. Even though it was something meant for both of them, she was the one who decided to break that promise. However, there was something she wanted to say while she still had the chance. The reason she broke off the engagement. It was at a social gathering in the north where the nobles gathered. The moment they found out she had been promised to the Dimitris, they started spreading all sorts of terrifying rumors. And the worst of all was discovering that he and Roman Dimitri used drugs. This one came from Dare. She knew that drugs eat away at reason and intelligence. She just wanted him to know this. She didn't know if they were true or false. It's just that she couldn't ignore it. Roman cut her off and said that whatever happened didn't matter since it didn't change the relationship they had. She didn't need to worry about him anymore. The poor thing was left there abandoned. Later that night, she had a conversation with Hans. He found it strange that she mentioned drugs since he didn't feel anything like that in this body. Even though there were some impurities, that metamorphosis had already removed all of that. He then called for Hans and asked if he had ever heard of him using drugs or doing anything like that. The guy was all confused, unsure if he should answer or not, but Roman said he wouldn't reprimand him. He was just trying to understand better the choices he had made in life. Hans, excited, said that not with his own eyes. However, there were moments when he thought the boy's behavior was a bit strange. Roman then asked when that was. Hans explained that the last time was 15 days ago when he saw him returning from a social gathering. Nothing major happened at that place, but the moment he returned, he seemed to be in a strange state. After that, he seemed to have lost the will to live and stayed in his room all day. Not to mention that every night he asked for an excessive amount of alcohol. This was one of the reasons Hans suspected he was using drugs. But now that he thinks about it, it really seems like a foolish idea. He remembers Flora mentioned those noble gatherings and asks who organized that party. Hans says it was the eldest son of the Barcos named Anthony. Roman begins to realize that all of this is very suspicious. The moment others find out he's going to be her fiancé, he suddenly takes his own life. Now he has a rough idea of what happened. There were some things that bothered him about Roman's death. In the message, it only said that he was afraid to go to battle, and that's why he took his own life. However, at that time, the marriage to Flora had already been decided, but he didn't mention anything about it. Not to mention that it would have been extremely easy for him to avoid the war with this marriage. But even with all of this, he took his life out of fear. Something about it didn't make sense. Roman then asked if he and this Anthony had always been close. Hans said they had been friends for a long time, but recently things didn't seem to be going well. It started when that marriage proposal with the Lawrences came up, because that would create a huge obstacle for the Barcos who wanted to conquer the Lawrence lands. And the quickest way was to prevent that marriage from happening. This confirmed to Roman that these guys were behind that letter. Hans then mentions that a few days ago, another letter with an invitation to a Barco's party arrived. This makes Buck curious. Hans explains that he didn't deliver it because Roman was in isolated training and asks what he should do with it. Now Roman laughs because it seems these guys are underestimating him. And that's one of the things the celestial demon hates the most. He asks when the party will be, and Hans says in 2 weeks. With that, Roman orders him to inform him that he will definitely attend. The scene shifts to the next day. Kevin is being guided to speak with Roman. However, Hans had already warned him not to be surprised by his change in appearance. He entered and asked if Roman had called for him. Roman turned and confirmed, but at that moment, Kevin was startled and asked what had happened to the young master. Beck ignored this and asked if he was adjusting. Kevin said yes, that the place was very good, and he had no problems. However, there was just one detail. He was still trying to understand what his role would be in this place. He offered to live for Roman's sake, but he didn't know what an ordinary and commoner like him could do. Roman simply said that he would be used as one of his swords. Kevin asked what that meant. Roman once again ignored him and said that it was impossible to choose someone's path for them. So he would give him 3 options. If he was afraid of killing, he wouldn't be a sword, but instead the hands and feet. He would learn everything from Hans to become a loyal follower. The second option was to become the sword and protect him by his side. Kevin interrupted, saying he had never used a sword, so it was impossible. Roman said he had already figured the boy would say that. He explained that if he chose this option, he would have to go through skeletal contortion. Obviously, the boy wanted to know what that was. Roman explained that it was a process where the pain caused would make a person feel as if their bones and muscles were being broken. In this way, he would prove his determination and potential through pain, not words. He drew the sword and said that the last option was for him to take it and cut off his own hand. If he could endure causing pain to himself and withstanding it until the end, he would become stronger than anyone. Beck remembered that even the mad demon who knew nothing of martial arts became a king. All of this depended solely on his own willpower. Ronan told him to choose because, regardless of the option, he would make it worthwhile. The only thing he was choosing was how he would be used. In an abandoned cabin outside Dimitri Castle. That was where Kevin was born. He was young and had to work to survive. Since he always had to help with everything, there was nothing he didn't know how to do. However, his life changed. No matter how much effort he made, there was always someone to take what was his. That was the life of someone weak. And that's why he couldn't forget what he saw. The overwhelming strength of Roman that day. He couldn't understand what cutting off his hand would explain, nor this business of destroying one's own body. However, if that meant becoming as strong as Roman, he said he would do it. The boy Roman was just watching, and Kevin prepared to make the cut. He took a deep breath and raised the sword. At the moment, he shouted and went to make the cut. Meanwhile, outside, Chris was talking about how he decided to follow the young master. But right after that, he decided to enter isolated training. He found Hans and asked where Roman was. Hans said the boy was training with Kevin, but warned that no one was allowed to enter. Chris had never heard of this kid, and asked who this Kevin was. Man, I thought he wasn't going to cut it, but the boy really did it, and Roman just stood there watching. But at night, Hans saw the sword and asked why it was covered in blood. But the boy only said there was nothing to worry about. That blood wasn't his. The truth is, Roman planned to put the boy in an illusion. That was the charm of the demon's illusion. The problem is that he made the cut before he could activate it. If he hadn't done something, the boy would have really cut off his entire arm. There were still 2 weeks until the party, and 6 months until the war. But Roman was eager because he had a lot of people to teach. Soon he would be very busy. In a room, he said that the mana cultivation technique he was going to teach was very dangerous. Kevin asked if he was really going to learn about mana. Roman simply said yes, but in reality, what he was going to teach was a technique from the mad demon himself. It was a spiritual art that consumed the user's mind in exchange for power. However, that could only be used by someone who could withstand extreme pain. And it was by putting the mad demon through that process that he managed to make him useful. If the boy didn't hesitate even to cut his arm, Roman believed he could learn it. He warned that it was a technique that would make him stronger. However, the pain would be much greater than yesterday. Even with all that, there was only one reason he was teaching it. Not only was it the fastest way for an untrained teenager to grow stronger, but it was also a technique that would allow him to protect whoever he wanted when he reached his peak. Kevin got excited and called for the young master. He said he couldn't express how grateful he felt, but he just didn't understand why Roman trusted him so much. He might have sworn loyalty, but nothing would stop him from running away after learning it. That's why he wanted to know why Roman trusted him so much. But the boy just said he trusted him because he did. Obviously, that left the boy even more confused. But Roman ignored him and told him to rest because the training would start tomorrow. Still, he thought that the mad demon had asked the exact same question. But unconditional trust is only received when you believe in the person. However, he knew Kevin wouldn't betray him. As soon as he became stronger, he would realize how dangerous it is to betray the celestial demon. It makes sense, right? Who would dare betray that guy? The next day, they were already practicing. Roman was teaching him the step-by-step of swordsmanship, how to maintain focus on each movement. Meanwhile, Chris was watching everything from the side. He was dying of boredom and didn't understand any of it. Why was Roman teaching swordsmanship to a guy who seemed to have no talent at all? Or worse, why wasn't he learning anything? He thought he'd get stronger if he followed this guy, but he was being treated like he didn't even exist. Maybe it would be better to go back to his master and ask to be accepted again. But he decided that for now, he'd wait a little longer. And so a few days passed. He threw his gloves on the ground, walked up to Roman, and called out to him, saying it had been 2 weeks since he decided to follow him. In the first week, he did the isolated training, and now in the second, he was there being ignored while he trained Kevin. He apologized for how he acted in the beginning, but he wanted to learn anything. Roman looked at him and said that he had already told him to learn just by watching. Obviously, Chris had no idea what he was talking about, but Roman warned that everyone has their own way of learning. Kevin didn't know anything, so until he reached a certain level, he needed to train. However, on the other hand, Chris was different, and no matter what Roman taught him because he had been defeated, he would accept any teaching without questioning it twice. Chris asked if he was really just going to keep observing. Roman said no and tossed a sword to him. He warned that he needed results to accept the truth, and that's why there would be a duel against Kevin. The poor kid was malnourished, but he would have to take a beating to develop his technique. Roman explained that he would teach Kevin how to defeat Chris, and Chris had to defeat him. If Chris truly believed he was right after this duel, then Roman would teach him personally. Poor Kevin was in shock, realizing he would have to fight a real knight. And Chris, of course, didn't want to duel with a novice. But once again, he got angry and wondered what Roman thought of him. But he decided that fine, he would show that he wasn't that weak now. With that, the two faced each other. Kevin said that no matter the situation, it didn't make sense for him to fight a 2-star knight. Ronan said it was obvious he was at a disadvantage, but he had nothing to lose by being defeated. There are countless people in this world who are stronger than him. Just as his family was oppressed by the Blood Fangs and Chris was trying to oppress him. Is he always going to back down when he encounters someone like that? Kevin, determined, said that he would try once. That made Chris even angrier, seeing a novice thinking he had a chance to win. He couldn't understand what Roman thought he would gain from this fight. But whatever, a duel is a duel. The second Roman gave the signal, Chris was already in front of him. There was no way he could lose to this beginner who had only a week of training. And with that, he landed the first attack squarely. Kevin noticed something and thought about making a move with his sword. However, Chris immediately knocked his arm aside and landed a hit right on his stomach. The poor kid was thrown far away, and he landed all twisted on the ground. Chris even thought it was weird that the boy was so weak. He thought there was a reason behind this duel that Roman would help with, but he was just standing there doing nothing. He couldn't understand what that madman was thinking. But either way, he was going to end this. Time passed, and our boy was just smiling, while poor Kevin was being beaten. Once again, he fell to the ground. Chris admitted that he was much better than he had thought, and for someone without mana, he really did much more than expected. But it was time to give up. After all, in the attacks he blocked, Chris hadn't even used all his strength. He could have split the boy's head in half, but in a duel, he avoided doing that. However, Kevin didn't seem very inclined to give up, and Chris said he would warn him one last time. If he planned to keep fighting, he wouldn't take responsibility for any broken limbs. But Kevin just laughed. Ronan smiled and Chris was confused, and the boy replied that he wanted to see how this would end. Roman once again told them both to prepare, when suddenly Kevin heard someone tell him to concentrate because he was about to take a surprise attack. Ronan gave the signal for the fight to begin, and Chris lunged, but this time Kevin blocked the first strike. The voice told him to step aside and aim at Chris's chest, but he got tangled up and stumbled. With that, Chris once again knocked his arm aside and landed a hit on his stomach. Kevin fell to the ground and the voice told him to get up. That's when he noticed that strangely, it seemed like he was hearing Roman's voice. Roman explained that this was a mana fluctuation technique that allowed sound to be transferred. He was using small particles near his ear so that only he could hear. Kevin had no idea something like that was possible. And at that moment, Roman told him to dive to the right. He did so and Chris missed the attack. Roman then told him to turn and aim at the left side of Chris's chest. He went to make the strike, but Chris dodged and landed a hit squarely on his ribs. Kevin realized what he lacked was speed. The voice told him to block the overhead attack and wake up, and he barely avoided another hit to the stomach. The voice told him to escape to the right, but once again, he took a hit to the face. The boy was really getting beaten, even with instructions. Chris remained impressed that the kid wouldn't give up, and Roman realized that the boy didn't stand a chance, since he couldn't respond quickly enough to the commands. However, for Roman, the situation was quite interesting. This was because Kevin was smiling, thinking that Roman was omnipotent. Even though Chris was a 2-star knight, Roman could give him the perfect commands to win. Kevin knew that the problem was his own body. If he had been following the tips correctly, he would have been winning. He realized that the true person being manipulated in that fight was Chris. He received a tip and once again dodged. At that moment, Roman told him to advance and try a counterattack, which Chris barely managed to dodge as well. But then Chris retaliated with a punch to his face. Chris began to realize that he was no longer able to knock the boy out and was only landing weak blows. And Kevin realized that even the esteemed knight, whom everyone thought was a genius, was extremely weak compared to Roman. For Kevin, that was the type of person he wanted to serve forever as his lord, So even if Roman said something that made no logical sense, he would just follow the orders blindly. For someone like him to become a true sword, there was only one answer. He would have to do it through sheer willpower. Some time passed. Kevin was still in the same situation, and Chris warned him for the 10th time, the last time, that if he continued like this, he would have to take responsibility if he got injured. But once again, Kevin smiled, and the scene repeated itself perfectly, with Kevin saying he wanted to see it through to the end. But then Chris lost his temper, calling him insignificant. If that's really what he wanted, he would give him what he was looking for. He would leave the boy with a crippled arm, and he would regret this moment. But Roman warned him to take a step forward and stop the attack halfway. The strike had to carry all the force he had, and Chris soon realized he had put himself in a bad position. However, he managed to move aside. Chris couldn't believe the kid had the courage to step forward in such a situation. And Roman told Chris to calm down because it wasn't over yet. He had to turn and go forward once more, and there he was obeying blindly. But Chris got angry because the attack was slow and full of openings. But he was startled. Once again, Kevin had set a trap and dodged, and now it was Chris who had no way to dodge. And with that, the strike was made. Roman was just smirking, and Chris couldn't believe it. He had almost been defeated by a boy who had been training for a week. Angry, he got up and struck Kevin's hand, making him drop the sword. Exhausted, the boy fell to the ground. Roman was just standing on the side, watching. He was impressed that Chris had really noticed that the second attack would be a feint. Chris only thought that the boy was a crazy fool. But Roman walked over and said that indeed Chris had won. So if he wanted, Roman would personally teach him from tomorrow onward. But the choice to learn would be up to him. Sometime later, Chris was worn out. He had no idea why he accepted that fight. He had nothing to gain from it and almost lost in the end. That last move was strangely similar to the one Roman used in their first duel. But what if he hadn't had that experience with Roman? Maybe he wouldn't have beaten Kevin without using mana. With that, yet another wild card in the story started laughing, saying that the day had matured with just that one experience. The next day, Roman asked what he would do. That's when Chris said he didn't want any more teachings, because he would grow stronger just by being by Roman's side. That duel taught him a lot, since Kevin's decisions were always the right ones for each situation. He thought the boy hadn't received any instructions, but in reality, he was wrong. Just by trying to understand Kevin's decisions, his mind was already filled with a wealth of teachings. He didn't know what had happened, but Roman was on a level that even Captain Jonathan couldn't reach. If that's the case, until the moment he becomes stronger than Roman, he will observe everything. While our boy smiled, Chris was there looking at him with pure hatred. But Roman simply said that today they would continue with the training. A few days passed, and the date for the Barco's social gathering arrived. A week before that, observing a painting, someone asks if they heard about it. The fact that Roman Dimitri canceled the marriage with the girl from the Lawrence family. A guy comments that apparently it was Flora's mistake, but people seem to believe that her father just felt sorry for her when he saw the appearance of that Dimitri idiot. A woman says that's crazy, considering they're about to go to war with the Barcos. And the man next to her responds that it just proves the eldest son of the Dimitris is worse than they thought. A maid mentions the fact that he supposedly defeated the Bloodfangs, but another says that's probably a lie just to cover up the end of the marriage and avoid embarrassment. Meanwhile, someone is dying of laughter, saying he can't believe it's so easy to manipulate the boy into breaking the marriage. He asks the butler if the boy will attend the party, and he confirms it. It's Antonio Barco, who says everything is going exactly as he planned. He's very excited for the coming week. On the day of the social gathering, Roman is questioning whether he really has to wear something like that. Hans says that since it's the first meeting after breaking the engagement, he must wear something amazing. He tells a long story about how incredible and expensive those clothes are, but he already knew the boy wouldn't wear them, even if he had spent his whole life preparing that outfit. Roman smiles at this. He says that if Hans puts so much effort into it, then he will wear it. Meanwhile, in front of the carriage, Chris says the boy is taking too long. At that moment, he comes running, apologizing. It's Kevin, who now indeed looks like a child, saying he didn't know how to put on armor. Chris asks why he's like that, and Kevin explains that there was no armor that fit him perfectly. Chris, however, couldn't forget that he almost lost to this kid just because he received help from Roman. The poor boy was all clumsy and didn't even know how to put on a helmet. But at that moment, Chris told him to pay attention. They were not only Roman's escort, but also the face of the Dimitris. This meant their reputation also depended on the actions they took. Kevin said he would keep that in mind. Sir Knight. Chris loved being called a knight and beamed, saying it was good to know Kevin had learned. The scene then shifts to a castle. Inside, many nobles were gathered, all from the most distinguished families in the region. One of them, holding a glass, asks if it's true that Roman will really show up. It's really funny that he's showing up after breaking the engagement that he himself wanted, especially knowing that the Barcos are targeting the Lawrences. A girl says that's why everyone considers him an idiot. Now the Dimitri's position had become completely ambiguous, all because of Roman. Another commented that at least he was going to participate, apparently to try to clean up the mess. The blonde girl asked what this Roman Dimitri was like. The guy next to her just said that he leaves a terrible impression since he's not powerful, not handsome, short, and weak. Another comments that any woman would try to break the marriage if forced into it. At that moment, the butler coughs in the middle of the room and announces that the eldest son of the Dimitris was arriving. With that, our boy appears, obviously shining with his platinum hair. No one could recognize him. The girls were all flustered, wanting to know if that was the Roman Dimitri. It didn't make sense for him to look so different, since he was shorter than everyone before. Not to mention that even his hair was different. The blonde girl was now standing there, taken aback, and immediately headed toward him. She said it was an honor to meet him and introduced herself as Sophia from the Gristle family. She said that perhaps he hadn't heard of her family since they were small, but her father dedicated his entire life to the kingdom of Cairo. Roman said he indeed knew them, and she was impressed. Ronan mentioned that it was impossible not to know a family with a history of hundreds of generations. Some time before, Hans had given him a book about all the families in the northern region, but he questioned Roman why he wanted that out of the blue. Roman responded that it was the least courtesy to know a little about the people he would meet. He would know the legacy of each person there and where they came from. That was an effort required for him to win the favor of others, especially for him, who was considered the Dimitri idiot. The boy studied extensively because he even knew they were famous for the quality of the wood they produced, and that one of her brothers recently learned to sense mana. He said he truly congratulates them on these achievements. People were just observing the conversation, wondering what on earth was going on. At that moment, another man introduced himself as the magnate of the Volt family. Roman said it was a pleasure to meet the eldest son of that family. He knew that Viscount Volt had achieved various victories in recent battles. The young man replied that he was grateful that Roman fought that way. Another person with pink hair came to introduce herself, saying that he had changed a lot. But the young man said that Lady Eris was as beautiful as ever. With that, a lot of people continued talking to him, all with smiles. Another approached and said he had judged him wrongly until now because he always thought he was drunk. Roman said he had been thinking of drinking, but if that was the case, he would abstain for a bit. Suddenly, the butler called for Roman and informed him that the young master was calling him to the back room. Finally, Roman was about to discover who was causing trouble for him. Outside the gathering, it was full of knights. Each of those families had brought their soldiers. Kevin asked what the deal was with this social party. Chris told him not to be interested as he would never attend one and ordered him to fix his helmet. A knight was watching what was going on, and one with green hair said that was the Dimitri escort. Kevin was innocently adjusting his helmet when someone burst out laughing and loudly said that it was a joke. He knew the eldest son was abandoned. He just didn't imagine he would bring a child who didn't even know how to hold a sword. Chris just told Kevin to ignore it. However, one of them asked what could be expected. Was that really the level of the Dimitris? The scene shifts to Roman a long time ago. At one of the social gatherings, he saw something. Flora for the first time. That's when Anthony approached and asked who he had his eye on. Roman asked if he knew the blonde-haired girl. His friend replied that she was Flora, known as the flower of the Lawrence family. Obviously, the boy fell in love. And now here's our Roman entering the room. All excited, he asks how much he's changed since they last saw each other. Roman was just observing. Anthony said he knew he had changed, but not this much, and told him to sit down and tell him everything that happened. Roman immediately noticed traces that some other people had been there. The fact that he made everyone leave as soon as Roman arrived meant he had a secret to share. Since Roman decided to make the guy comfortable, Roman then said that he wasn't sure either. He spent a fortune to make some changes in himself, and now, even he had lost track of how much he had changed. But in any case, it was good to see his old friend. Anthony was just observing, and said that indeed, it could be seen positively. He didn't know what the boy was thinking back then. Roman asked what time he was talking about. Anthony mentioned the time he was caught sleeping with his cousin, when he was already promised to the Lawrence daughter. It was truly an incredible time. He found it crazy that he would go so far with his future marriage considering that happened. But if he was here today at this party, it meant he wanted to accept the proposal. And he assured Roman not to worry, that he would keep it a secret. They should discuss his marriage to the Barco family. That was information Roman had no idea about, when suddenly, he felt something strange, and seemed to recall a memory. He remembered betraying Anthony Barco, and begging his father to create a political marriage with the Lawrence family. But even so, he didn't want to avoid his friends, and would use this chance to rebuild the relationship he had with them. That day, Anthony introduced him to Emily Barco. He asked if it was okay for her to drink with them there that day. Roman said Cindy here was part of the family. Anthony told them to serve Roman, but he said he knew how to serve himself. At that moment, the guy changed and asked if he was getting full of himself just because he was going to get married. Roman was confused, but Anthony said he was joking, since they didn't even care about that family anymore. Roman was happy to know there wouldn't be a problem then. And of course, Anthony told him to drink as much as he wanted. And so the poor guy did. What happened next you already know. The boy woke up the next day in bed. He had no idea where he was or what was going on, when suddenly someone burst into the room and shouted his name. It was Anthony, furious, asking what he had done. Roman had no idea because he had just passed out. He didn't remember anything. Sometime later, Anthony said he didn't care who the boy slept with, but this time it had been with Miss Barco. and he couldn't let the matter slide easily. He gave the boy the chance to end that marriage unilaterally, or he would have to marry a direct descendant of the Barco family to improve relations between them. Even though he was furious, he would forgive him because they were friends. However, he would have to give an answer. Back in the present, Back now knew exactly what happened. If what happened that day were discovered, the honor of the Dimitris would be ruined, and Roman didn't have the courage to face his father and confront his anger. On the other hand, he couldn't break the marriage because he truly loved Flora. Since it had been forced by him, it would defame the princess. That's why his decision was to take his own life to resolve the situation. A weak man who never achieved anything with his own hands. That was Roman Dimitri. Truly a miserable and pathetic life. Anthony asked why he was hesitating so much and said that the union of their two families would create something extremely powerful in the region. No one could stand against them, and together they would have all the power in the north. But Roman simply asked if that was the only reason. Confused, Anthony stood still for a moment, and Roman asked if he had to accept this political relationship just because of that reason. Anthony tried to remind him that this wasn't a choice. If he refused, everything that happened that day would be exposed to the world. At that moment, Roman simply put his foot on the table and said that apparently Anthony had forgotten, so he would say it again. Dimitri had no reason to accept the Barco's proposal. Meanwhile, outside, the gathering was going on smoothly, until something caught Sophia's attention. Of course, it was Roman again, and she asked where he had been. He replied that he had something to resolve, and unfortunately, because of that, he would have to leave. She looked sad, saying she wished he could stay a little longer. He said it was urgent, but everyone was asking him to stay, saying they wanted to talk about many things. But Roman just excused himself and left, until he heard someone telling another to take back what they said. He recognized the voice and tried to get closer. That's when he saw something he didn't expect. A helmet hit the ground, and one of the knights had hit Kevin. Just before that, the man had said that was the level of the Dimitris. Chris just told him to calm down because it wasn't worth it. But the men seemed to have noticed something. They approached, asking why they brought a child whose helmet didn't even fit his head. They got closer and said it looked like they picked up a kid from the street and put armor on him to call him an escort. Chris asked if they were training more to be clowns than to use a sword. The man ignored him and said he was confident he could beat this kid without any training. That's why everyone calls their lord an idiot. Kevin told him to take back what he said because he shouldn't refer to Roman like that. The man was confused, but Kevin just grabbed his hand and told him to take back what he said. That's when the man slapped his helmet. The poor kid didn't even react, and Chris thought about drawing his sword, but he knew those were Barco's knights. If he really did that, it would cause chaos between the two families. He wasn't just causing trouble for the young master, but for everyone there. From the ground, Kevin said he was Roman's knight, and that he never wanted to be a knight if it meant being like the bunch of thugs they were. The man just chuckled and moved toward him, saying he wanted to see how far his pride would take him. That's when someone grabbed his wrist. Everyone was in shock. It was Roman, calmly asking what was going on. He just took a look. The moment the man started to say his name, he got slapped in the face. He was completely confused, not understanding what happened. Not only did he get slapped, but he couldn't even react. He was about to say something, but got slapped again, not understanding. Once again, he didn't know where the slap came from. It was becoming a joke. He tried to speak again and got slapped in the ear. The poor guy was already shrinking, and now he was about to kiss the ground. He was starting to get traumatized, not knowing what sequence this was. But Roman simply told him to lift his head again. Meanwhile, in the room, Anthony was there. He couldn't understand what had just happened. At the meeting, he warned Roman that if he didn't accept the proposal, he would be making an irreversible mistake. But Roman just replied that his reputation was already bad, so having one or two more rumors wouldn't change anything. And he warned Anthony that he should behave a little better. He had chosen to cancel this marriage on his own, not because of that threat. But since the Dimitris were no longer allied with the Lawrences, in a way, Anthony's goal had been achieved. However, at any moment, Roman could decide to help the Lawrences, and that would interfere with the Barcos. And maybe he should do that just because of those threats. Roman had already researched a lot about the Barcos. They had an influence with the central government that couldn't be ignored. But that's all they had and nothing more. If one were to truly consider wealth and power, the Dimitris were the real force in the north. He then asked Anthony what he wanted to do. Anthony, fearful, only asked if he was no longer going to help the Lawrences, and Roman replied that he was correct. With that, Anthony said it would be better to forget about this matter. However, he couldn't understand why this boy had changed so much. The way he acted, looked, and even spoke had completely changed. He was no longer the idiot he knew. What he wanted to know was what the hell had happened to this boy. At that moment, someone called for Anthony, who said he didn't want to talk. But the person insisted, saying there was a problem with the knights he had brought. Outside, something was still going on, and everyone was scared. The Barco knight was at Roman's feet, begging for forgiveness and saying he would never do it again. Kevin said the man had already been punished enough, and Chris agreed, saying he should reconsider his relationship with the Barcos. However, Roman said that he was the one who decided when this man had been punished enough. Even if he died, that was the price for his actions. At that moment, Anthony appeared and asked what the meaning of this was. He warned that even if Roman was the eldest son, he wouldn't tolerate such behavior, and it would be better for him to start apologizing. Roman just asked why he would do that. That man had insulted him and laid hands on a member of the Dimitri family. He then asked Anthony if he really thought he was wrong. Anthony responded that regardless, he had crossed the line. Ronan reminded him that if he continued like this, their relationship might be destroyed. So it was best for Anthony to control his actions a bit better. Since he wasn't a patient person, he wanted to know what Anthony was going to do now. Anthony remembered that Roman had threatened to rekindle relations with the Lawrences. As much as he hated it, he had no choice. And he said that indeed, seeing the situation, it seemed Roman was right. He also would have had to punish that man the same way. Roman left, saying that they indeed got along well. But it wasn't over yet. He went up to the soldier, raised his hand, and told the man to prepare his face. This went on for a while. The old Roman was a person everyone disrespected, even though he was from the family that was the greatest power in the north. He called Chris and Kevin and said they were leaving. But now, everyone who was present had no choice but to recognize that the idiot they had heard about no longer existed. On the way back in the carriage, there was silence, and Kevin apologized since Roman had been insulted because of him. And Chris apologized for not doing anything when they spoke ill of the Dimitris. Roman stayed silent for a moment. He said he knew it couldn't have been easy for them to endure that until he arrived. So it was a good job that they managed to hold on. Being hasty would only have led to the worst-case scenario. But that wasn't the answer he wanted. Since no one in the entire north should have the courage to lay hands on the Dimitri family, they've got to remember the faces of those men and never forgive them. Because Roman doesn't accept anyone being above him. And the only ones who can follow him are those who are above everyone else. And they would have to adapt to live that way. Back at the Dimitri mansion, someone handed over papers about the Barco family. It was Hans, who mentioned that lately those guys had been taking some strange actions. Roman already knew that the Barcos had appeared in the northern region over 100 years ago, but they only started gaining relevance when someone from the family entered the central government. Roman commented that their military strength was much weaker than he had thought. Hans agreed, saying it was strange that their status was so high considering they were so weak. Roman said that this proves how strong the central government is. The Salamander continent has 6 kingdoms, and Cairo is the smallest and weakest. That's because it's surrounded by all the others, so they've always been attacked throughout history. Because of the strong enemies at the borders, they were forced to join the central government to survive. That's because their authority in recruitment is absolute. If a family rejects the recruitment, troops are immediately sent to that place. After the kingdom is taken, the lands are divided among those who participated in the conquest. Roman believed that's why the Barcos are currently so influential. And Hans said that apparently, that's the only explanation. And now they knew how they got a big loan from the bank. Probably with that money, they must have bought some mercenary companies. And most likely, the Burgess mercenary company will be hired since they're famous for territorial disputes. Hans said that at the pace things are going, the attack on the Lawrences will happen in half a month. Roman knew that if that's the case, they had nothing left to prepare. Hans commented that if the Barcos really attack, the Lawrences will survive for at most a month. Now Roman was thinking that he had told the Barcos that he wouldn't get involved in the Lawrence case. However, he wouldn't be able to live as Roman Dimitri if he let someone threaten him and get away with it. Not to mention, no matter what the Barcos did, they would never have enough power to defeat the Dimitris. It would be extremely easy to defeat them if he simply used the power of his family. But in this region, because they weren't nobles, no one saw the Dimitris as a threat, and he needed to create an opportunity to enter the grand stage of this world, just as he had done in the past. He then stood up and told Hans that he needed to find his father now. It was time for them to make money from the promise that was made to them. The scene shifts to a lot of scared people in the city, and a man in bloodied armor arriving. It's the rank B mercenary Lucas, who says that apparently the Dimitris haven't changed at all. The scene then shifts to a blacksmith. The man says his items are destroyed, and asks Lucas if the fight was really that difficult. He replies that it was hard because the guys he was with were so dumb, and almost everyone died. The blacksmith says that this sword is of low quality and asks where he bought it. He said he had to grab one from some shop and he almost lost his life because of it. The old man says he should know that the best items and weapons are always made by the Dimitris. Lucas stands up and says he already knows that, which is why he's here to request a full set. To him, it doesn't matter how long it takes since he'll be recovering here in Dimitri. He's already tired of the battlefield. That's when he sees some people gathering and looking at flyers. He wonders why everyone seems so excited. Usually, that only happens when there's a war or a really good job. He decides to take a look, and there's a recruitment notice. The notice only says that the person needs to be healthy and have the desire to get stronger. There are 30 spots and the salaries would be 8 silver coins per month. Lucas thinks that considering a family of 5 lives on 5 silver coins, it's pretty good even considering the risks. That is if it weren't for this special condition. The person would belong to Roman Dimitri and not the entire family, and only those who are willing to risk their lives for him should sign up. The old man next to him tells him not to even dream since hundreds have already applied. Lucas laughs and says that as a rank B mercenary, someone like him would cost at least 50 silver coins. But then he notices what the man said, and asks if hundreds of people have really already registered. The old man says yes, everyone who saw the notice ran to apply. Lucas then asks why everyone is so eager to work for the Dimitri idiot. Imagine the suffering a soldier would endure being under an idiot like that. At that moment, everyone fell silent, and the man only said that Lucas must not be very informed since he's an outsider. Lord Dimitri had taken down the Bloodfangs and was taking care of his people. No one believed it at first until they heard what Clark said. That's because since Clark's son became one of Roman's subordinates, his entire family has changed. He wonders what the boy's name was again, and then he remembers it was Kevin. A little earlier at the mansion, Kevin asked why he wanted to take a break, but Roman only said that rest was part of the training, so he had 3 days to relax. It was a reward for his hard work, so he should enjoy some time with his family. Kevin just thanked him. However, taking a break now felt strange to him, since in the past he couldn't even survive even working every day. He wondered how his family was doing since he had been at the castle for so long. On the way, Hans met him, handed him some clothes, and said that Lord Roman had those prepared before he went to meet his family. Besides that, he also sent some money so Kevin could buy some gifts before seeing them. From now on, he would be earning 30 silver coins a month so he could spoil his parents a little. And now he was walking through the city, all bright and cheerful. He had never worn such fine clothes or felt so calm. Not to mention it was the first time he was bringing fresh bread to his family. He was excited since his sister always said it was her dream to eat fresh bread, and she always complained when she had to eat those hard pieces of bread. Unfortunately, no matter how much he worked, buying something like that was impossible, especially considering the situation his family was in. But now, no matter what happens, he will become stronger, and that will never happen again since he's being guided by Roman. However, he notices something strange. His mother is quite calm. His father is even eating pastries, and his sister is playing with flowers. He had no idea they were living like this. He imagined they had been sent to a better place, but not like this. And at that moment, they called out to Kevin. All excited, they hugged the boy and said they missed him. He was going to ask about the house, but his father said it was Hans who had given it to them to cultivate. Not to mention that the city's knights also helped with the entire move. Suddenly, Kevin started crying and thanked Lord Roman. But that's when his father noticed something. He saw the slap mark on the boy's face and asked what it was, wanting to know if Roman had hit him. Kevin explained that no, it wasn't that. But his mother said he didn't need to lie. He pushed her away and told her not to even think about it because Roman wasn't that kind of person. And that's when he decided to explain the truth. And his father later commented to his friends at the bar. They were shocked to learn that Roman had hit a Barco knight just because of an insult. In the city, everyone knew that the Clarks were living much better since their son started working for Roman. They not only got a house but also land a farm. The story was so surreal that people even speculated it might just be someone who looked like him. But now the dream of poor children was to be like Kevin and work for Roman. Everyone wanted to gain his trust and improve their own lives. And that's why the place was full of people. Lucas couldn't believe any of these incidents. The Roman Dimitri he had seen in a casino 2 years ago would never have done something like that. It made him wonder what had happened in that time. But he was curious, so he wanted to take a look. Back at the mansion, someone was commenting that the preparations were going correctly. They would provide some of the soldiers, but Lord Roman would handle the entire process. However, the person asked if he was really okay with this and said it was the last chance to back out. That's because developing an army that depends on one person is extremely dangerous. But Romero commented that when he heard Roman was going to attend the social gathering, he thought the boy was going to team up with the Barcos to remove his younger brother from the succession. But what he did was go against Anthony and beat up his knights, even knowing that his brother might join forces with the Barcos, and that would end his chances of succession. That made Romero realize that his son had started living the way he wanted since that incident with the Bloodfangs. And as a father, he was curious to know what his son wanted to achieve. Jonathan said that was fine. He understood then. Romero asked if they had at least 50 people registered, because with fewer than that, it would be difficult to form an army. But Jonathan said that so far, there had already been over 500 people. Of course, the father had no idea why that was. The scene shifts to the day of the recruitment. Everyone there is anxiously waiting to see what will happen. And Chris goes to the back and calls for Roman. He informs him that all the preparations for the test are now complete. A day before the test, Alec was in a bar drinking heavily, saying that the Dimitri's dark beer was always the best. But he couldn't believe it. There were really far more applicants than he had imagined. Not to mention that there were 3 loud guys in the corner. From the copper plates on their thighs, he knew those were at least rank C mercenaries. The others at the counter clearly had combat experience. Considering the number of bars that must be filled with people like them, the level of the applicants was much higher than he had expected. But it didn't make sense since, for experienced people, there should be a better job than this. He didn't know if it was curiosity or what, but he couldn't understand. Then he overheard a guy asking his friend if he wasn't going to become a Lawrence soldier. The guy said yes, as that was his hometown. But after seeing Dimitri take down the Bloodfangs, he changed his mind. Everyone who didn't see it says it's a lie, but he was there that day in the middle of the square. when Dimitri showed up covered in blood and dragged the leader by his hair. To him, it was unbelievable to think that Dimitri came all the way from his territory just to kill that guy in front of everyone for messing with his people. The image of that scene never left his mind. A lot of people deny the incident and say it's a lie, but he was there to see firsthand that Dimitri wasn't the weak and idiotic person all the rumors said. He really was a leader who fought for his people, and that's why he's there to gain residency in Dimitri and become one of his subordinates. Lucas understood that what the boy meant was that it was worth dedicating his life to this person. Maybe all this commotion really wasn't a coincidence. Back on the day of the big test, everyone was there, excited and chatting, while Lucas was now undecided about which choice he should make. He knew that the strongest people there, like him, still had doubts about the rumors. This meant that the choice could only be made when he saw the true Roman. Suddenly, everyone fell silent. It was because someone was approaching. Of course, it was our armored boy. He passed by and everyone bowed. Lucas noticed that no command had been given, but still, everyone lowered their heads. This proved that the rumors were true. Dimitri only climbed the stairs and told everyone to lift their heads. As mentioned in the notice, he would recruit 30 soldiers to fight by his side. But first, he wanted to inform them that he, Roman Dimitri, had no plans to live in an isolated territory for the rest of his life. He would continually fight and conquer ever larger territories. He would be involved in wars where it would be impossible not to lose lives. So those who plan to follow him without being fully determined should turn back now. What they should think when their head flies on the battlefield is not resentment for being sent there by him, but regret for not being by his side at the moment he reigns supreme over this continent. The entire crowd fell silent. Lucas just couldn't understand why someone with his position in his own family at risk was being so arrogant. But for some strange reason, that man made him believe it. With that, Chris stepped forward and said he would explain the instructions for the test. The test was extremely simple. They would stay in a designated spot and the archer would fire 3 arrows at them. Maybe they would graze their body, or hit the wood right behind them, or even hit them directly. Only those who didn't move an inch after all 3 arrows were fired would pass the first stage of the test. With that, the first name was called. The man stood in front of the wood and the archer prepared. However, the others were wondering if they were really going to do this. It didn't make sense to put a soldier's life at risk for this test. He knew that Archer was extremely talented. Surely he would never make a mistake. The first arrow was fired, and it struck right next to the man's neck. Seeing this, the man thought it could only be a psychological test. He just had to stand still and be sure nothing would happen. After all, he knew the arrows would miss. At the moment, he was speechless. The people were terrified, and the man couldn't believe it. He fell to the ground and began to writhe in pain. Chris told them to get him out of there and start treating him immediately. With that, the man was indeed taken away on a stretcher. The people began to ask if Dimitri was really asking them to be hit by an arrow. Chris just called for Morrison's name. It was the man who was next in line and had seen what happened. That arrow went straight into his leg, but if it had been his head, he would have died. To him, this was too insane, and all he wanted was his chance to become a knight. Chris realized that everything was happening just as Roman had said, and with that, he stated that it seemed the second man had given up. He warned that anyone afraid of getting hit by an arrow should quit now, and ordered all the cowards to leave that place immediately. A little earlier, someone had said they would explain each person's role. The 4 there tomorrow would be hit by an arrow. The man next to them was the best archer in the region and would only hit non-fatal spots. There would be the reward they would receive for this: a chest full of gold coins. Obviously, taking an arrow for all that seemed worth it. Roman said there would be medics on hand, but it wouldn't change the fact that the arrow would be real. He asked if the men wanted it, and they all said yes. With that, the men left, and Chris asked why Roman was going so far. He explained that you can't build an army just with threats. He needed people willing to put their lives on the line. Even if the chance of being hit was 1 in 100, some people would still quit because of that 1% chance. Chris asked what the condition was that people would have to meet to become a subordinate. Ronan said he wanted someone with an extremely resilient psyche and mentality, someone born with the heart of a beast. Chris was confused because that was more important than experience. Roman said that someone like that would become stronger than anyone else, regardless of where they came from, and only those stronger than everyone else would walk by his side. But now everyone was wondering what kind of insane test this was. A good part of the applicants were already leaving, saying it wasn't worth taking an arrow just for a chance to serve Dimitri. Chris mentioned that at least 100 had already left, and he turned to call for Roman. He was thinking about the heart of a beast, which is an innate talent, just like Kevin, who was ready to cut off his own hand without any hesitation, or Chris, who ignored the humiliation he suffered in front of everyone to ask about how to become stronger. That's the kind of person who has the heart of a beast. No matter how strong someone's physique is, when they are born, they can't defeat someone like that. That's the type of person he wants to find in this test. So he gave the order for the test to continue. The next participant was panting heavily. Lucas remembered the guy from the bar. It seemed he really meant it when he said he wouldn't give up, but he was trembling a lot. He was terrified, but this was his only chance to show loyalty. There was no way he would quit without even trying. The first arrow nearly grazed his head. He looked at it and knew he could have died. Another arrow was being prepared and he wondered if he should give up. The second arrow hit right next to his arm, and he knew it would all be meaningless if he left now. But the last one was coming, and there was still time for him to back out. He wanted to say something, but the fear was overwhelming. And with that, the arrow struck the middle of his leg. Chris announced that Henderson had passed. Lucas realized the man was about to quit, but got lucky. The arrow was fired in time. And so the tests continued. Out of 500 participants, after 100 fled, 400 remained. And out of those, only 120 had the courage to endure all 3 arrows. Roman observed each person who passed. Those who trembled but still stood their ground, and those who remained still without even flinching. To him, both were equal because they had the courage to suppress their fears. Now it was time to start looking for the hidden gems. Those who would look at him with admiration, not fear. Roman had congratulated everyone but warned that he would only accept 30 people. And for that, they would have to go through a second test. Those who became his subordinates would live the life of a predator. And strangely, he only said that, leaving Lucas confused. Roman simply stated that the orders for the second test were straightforward. There were various swords of different types and shapes beside them, but none of that mattered. They just had to choose the sword they wanted and prove their worth in a duel against him. Lucas wondered if the man really planned to fight 120 people. Roman announced that all they needed to do was last 1 minute against him. Those who passed would receive even better conditions than those listed. The bald man then stepped forward and declared he would be the first. This guy had the look of someone who had fought 1,000 times, but let's see if he could endure this. With that, they were already face to face. Roman asked for his name, and the man said it was Vulcan. He questioned if the sword was good, and Vulcan said it wasn't a problem. Vulcan thought that Dimitri's confidence was a bit overblown, but although it was true that Roman had taken down the Bloodfangs alone, it was impossible for him to be defeated in a minute. Chris then told them to prepare. For Vulcan, surviving a minute would be easy, and he was more interested in testing the person he was going to serve. And Chris said they would start. Vulcan immediately lunged, saying he would find out what kind of man Roman was, and launched an attack with all the strength he had. But in a second, Roman dodged and was already at his side, and just made him look like a fool by tapping his foot, making him fall. Vulcan tried to get up, but at that moment, the sword was already at his neck. Roman simply called for the next one. At that moment, Lucas realized that this man was on a completely different level. This test was entirely incomparable to the first. When everyone saw the volcano being instantly defeated by Roman, they knew how strong he was. However, they all thought the same thing. As more and more duels took place, he would get tired. Then, it would be easier to defeat him at that moment. However, half of the duels had already happened, and 60 people had already been defeated. Roman wasn't showing any signs of fatigue, and Henderson was thinking about what he said before this all started, surviving as a predator if he won that. He realized that Roman lives like a predator, a person who does whatever he wants in a world where the strongest survive. Everyone knows that at this moment, Roman is still considered the fool of the Dimitris. This might be the only chance in life to become his subordinate. The problem is, how do you defeat a monster like that? At that moment, Roman says that if no one steps forward, everyone will fail. A guy then says he's going to participate. Finally, it was Lucas's turn. He introduced himself and said he was number 61. He already knew that Roman Dimitri was a monster. Compared to what he knows, these abilities were overwhelming. And it's unbelievable that he exerts so much pressure just by standing there. And after watching the first duels, he really believes this guy won't just stand there. He doesn't care about the 8 silver coins per month. He's more curious to see where this guy will be in a year. And to do that, he first has to pass this test. Chris is impressed. This is the first person to attack directly since the first participant. Not to mention, the right hand was aiming at the head, while the left hand was already prepared to counterattack at the heart. Roman easily blocked the first strike, and Lucas noticed that the backward movement put him out of reach of the dagger. However, he wanted to know what he would do with it, and he sent the dagger in Roman's direction while launching another attack with the sword. However, Roman blocked the attack and deflected the dagger with the scabbard. As soon as Lucas saw this, he retreated once again. From his experience, every knight eventually starts to have some opening as they get tired. However, at this moment, Roman was like an impenetrable fortress. But he couldn't stop now, as it would be over for him if he hesitated for even a second. If he wants to pass this test, he has to keep the initiative. Roman smiles and asks if his name is Lucas, and says that it's not bad at all. This isn't the right attitude on a battlefield, but it is the correct one in a duel. Clearly, the boy had a natural instinct. However, it's obvious that he wouldn't let the guy hold out for a minute that easily. This 1 minute is actually to show how powerful the squad he is going to create will be. And the purpose of this test is to establish the difference in strength so that they always remember it. And to do something like that, he would have to end this once and for all. At that moment, Roman goes on the attack while Lucas is still dodging. But remember that the guy is a B-rank mercenary. Everyone considers that the limit of effort, this is the maximum of a regular person who has no mana control. And since the first condition to reach a rank is at least to have awakened mana, he reached his limit, and no matter how hard he tries, he will never leave B rank. However, even so, he survived. On battlefields where countless mana users died over and over again, he stayed alive. And that's how he realized that to survive and win, you always use any means necessary. Roman ends up not being able to complete the attack. And Chris remembers that in the rule, he never said anything about not being able to throw sand in the eyes. The only mission given is to survive for a minute and nothing more. As soon as Lucas falls, he immediately gets up again to attack. However, he stops for a second. Roman was clearly ready to defend against this attack. Even though his eyes were red, he was still looking directly at him. With that, he just laughed. He dropped the dagger and said he surrendered. In the Celestial Demon Cult, the first thing you learn before fighting is how to keep your eyes open at all times. That's because in a fight, a blink of an eye is enough for someone to die. Just like breathing has to be controlled every second, blinking is also something that has to be considered. And that's why they always train to keep their eyes open in any situation, no matter what happens. A person should never give in to fear or try to escape without observing what's going on. He then hands Roman a bottle of water. As Roman washes his face, he stands there desolate. He wouldn't have used sand if he had known the guy wouldn't change his expression. It just made him look pathetic for using everything he had available and still failing. He wonders if Roman would be disappointed, but then remembers that he had no expectations. Maybe then he would be punished for it. But Roman only called for the next. Lucas was confused that the guy didn't even comment on it, and the people in the audience wondered the same thing. Why didn't he mention that dirty move? But Roman already knew about that plan. The moment he dodged, he saw the movement, his hand going to his waist and grabbing that sack. However, he decided to continue to see what he would do in the best situation. The hell Lucas experienced and the amount of blood he saw, he has no doubt. The blood seen by Bake was enough to create an ocean. That's how a celestial demon is created. He then asks if no other applicant will step forward. And with that, time begins to pass. And another guy enters the field. Once again, he dodges the attack. However, now everyone was trying to play dirty. So he tried to throw a stone at Roman. Chris noticed that Lucas's influence is making everyone want to last at least a minute. However, even so, none of that was enough. Lucas realized that the dirty move didn't disqualify anyone, but at the same time, Roman didn't feel any pain. And now it was the next person's turn. The problem is that none of this was making sense. 2 hours had passed with duels and his breathing was still steady. In the battlefield over a sea of bodies, no one goes easier on you just because you're tired. Your movements become slow and your breathing unstable. That's how you become just another corpse. That's why, for someone who wants to survive on the battlefield, breathing must be perfect and continuous. However, Roman knows how to circulate nature's mana to alleviate the body's fatigue. Combining that with skeletal change, he manages to keep his body in perfect condition. During his times at Bach, he participated in wars that lasted up to 3 days. So of course, he wouldn't get tired from light training like this. Chris then tells all the applicants to gather, and he says that the number of people who pass the second test is equal to 0. However, that doesn't mean no one will succeed because they need to select 30. He tells them all good job and says they're dismissed. A while later, Roman hands in the list of participants who passed and informs Chris that he will have to train those. He says he understands and takes a look at the people who passed. Vulcan, who lost in one move, had enough courage to go before everyone else. He finds it strange that Henderson passed since he didn't find anything special in the kid. Maybe the master saw something he didn't. He finds the rest understandable, except for one. He asks if Lucas really passed, and Roman says yes. Roman asks if there's a problem with that, and Chris responds that he acknowledges Lucas is very talented for a B-rank mercenary. But not only did he commit a grave foul in the middle of the duel, but he also gave up before being attacked. A guy like that would only cause problems on the battlefield. It's not even about honor. It's because the average mercenary would abandon comrades to survive. However, Roman says that's precisely why he passed him. Of course, the poor guy is totally confused. But Roman says it's exactly because he isn't a coward who knows honor that he passed. At the moment when everyone was worried about Roman's judgment, he saw an opportunity and acted instantly. That's the kind of person who survives on the battlefield, doing whatever it takes. So he asks Chris why he was so sure Lucas would betray his comrades, just because of a foul. He remembers that Jonathan once said that those who survive on the battlefield aren't the ones who know how to use aura, but rather those who calmly analyze each situation and act accordingly. He needed to keep in mind that no matter how strong he was as a knight, there was always a chance he could be killed by one of these. Those who hide in the shadows and look for a chance to strike. Chris realizes that in that situation, it really was the most realistic thing for Lucas to do. Once again, he was the one who couldn't see things clearly. However, he then tells Roman there's one more thing he doesn't understand. The battlefield won't start for another 5 months. And it's not like the nobles were 100% forced to go, since there's always a political way to avoid it. So why is he already gathering his soldiers when he could escape? Ronan says it will be announced soon. The official letter from the Barco family. In it, they said they had been waiting a long time for the Lawrences to fulfill their past agreement. However, they betrayed their honor and commitment to the nobles. And that's why the Barcos decided to raise their swords after much patience. The sins of the Lawrences were clear, and they weren't willing to pay the debts owed by their ancestors. They even had the nerve to declare that they wouldn't surrender any land as collateral. and that's why this notice was to inform everyone in the kingdom of Kiro. The Lawrence family has 1 week to surrender the lands, or else the central government will support, and a territorial war will be waged against the Lawrence territory. When Chris hears this, he asks if that's what Roman is preparing for. Roman says that's exactly it. This troop will get involved in the war between these two. Meanwhile, someone remembers failing the family. The person who was responsible for making the Dimitris no longer support the Lawrences. To Flora, she was the one to blame for everything happening to the family and the territory. She wakes up in the middle of the night. Every day she was having these nightmares, and she kept asking herself what she had done. In the Lawrence mansion, everyone was wondering if it was because of the broken engagement. It seems she had been rejected by Dimitri because she had made a mistake. However, now she wasn't even leaving her room, and the war against the Barcos was about to begin. Standing inside it, she couldn't even get out of bed. She always thought she was a smart person. She passed the advanced class at the academy with great grades. From her father's warm smile, she always thought she was a good daughter. But now she realized that without the family support, she was nothing but a flower in a cage. The guy being called the fool of the Dimitris was something hilarious, because in the end, the fool was her. Now she doesn't even have the confidence to look her father in the eye. She wonders what he would do in this situation. If she stopped to think, Roman is the complete opposite of her. No one had any expectations or desires about what he would do. However, with his own strength, he subdued the blood prisoners and elevated the family's name. She doesn't understand how he was able to do something like that without anyone and why he's so strong. But even putting all that aside, the difference between them is that he had the courage to act. At this moment, one of the butlers knocks on the door and says that the meal is ready. The servants begin to look at each other with concern as she never appears. When she finally opens the door, visibly shaken, she says she's going to the library. She knows her father is doing his best to get some help from other families. However, she knows that no one will help them in this situation. This means that just as Roman resolved the blood prisoners by himself, they will have to find a way out of this with the strength they have. Meanwhile, someone calls for Lawrence in his room, informing him that the Martel family has refused the proposal. He says to contact the Vaster family, but the person responds that they have also already refused. The person tries to explain that no matter who they ask, no one will want to bet on a war against the Barcos. Moreover, there will always be rumors that whoever supports them in this war will suffer afterward. Besides, in the announcement, the central government gave its support, so those who don't participate also have a chance to receive lands. Meanwhile, Flora is just reading books. She knows there's 1 week left. That's the time she has until this war begins. She needs to find the best course of action in this situation. Meanwhile, her father punches the table, angry because those bastards always favored him, but now in this war, no one is supporting them in the conflict. He asks if the gold bank will lend anything, and he says yes, but the investigation will only be completed in a week, which makes it obvious that they are basically siding with the Barcos. He wonders if there really is no solution, and one of the men at the table says that perhaps it's just better to surrender to the Barcos. All the support they would receive from neighbors has been cancelled, so by surrendering, they would protect some innocent soldiers and not lose everything. No one in the room could argue against that. Even Lawrence said it was something to consider. However, that's when someone at the door said Miss Flora wanted to talk. He was going to say he was busy, but she opened the door at that moment. Her father asked what she was doing there. She said she had something to say. However, this story likes to jump back and forth, so now we're back to Roman's conversation with Chris. At the moment, he said that Roman Dimitri would get involved in the war between the Barcos and the Lawrences. Actually, it's not Chris, it's his father who asks if he really knows what that means. He says yes, and his father asks why he wants to go through with it. This is a legitimate war of the Barcos, confirmed by the central government. And since he canceled the marriage with the Lawrence lady, they have no right to get involved in this. If they get involved in a war without any reason, all the nobles will break ties and they will be subdued. His father says it seems that the son is not as rational as he thought he had become. However, Roman calls for him and asks how he wants him to live from now on. His father, confused, questions why he's bringing this up out of nowhere. But Roman says he's not getting involved in this war just because of a change of heart. He tells his father that he received a threat from Anthony Barco that complicated the marriage he was going to have. He has no way to plan, but when he heard that, one thing came to mind. People say that the Dimitris are the true strength of the North, but for some reason, the Barcos still think they are above. As he is the lord of that place and does nothing, he believes that he must be satisfied with the situation. However, Roman Dimitri is different and wants power. He won't stand by and watch the name of the Dimitris be tarnished, whether by the Barcos or anyone else. He has more than enough reason, just as the Barco War is merely a non-existent excuse to gain more power. In this new life, Roman feels as if he's in an endless ocean, but his identity as Bak hasn't changed. He will live a life of domination. He tells his father that he's not asking for the family's help, as he will participate in this war only as Roman Dimitri. All his father has to do is watch. The path he will show is the life he will live from now on. His father knows that your birthplace never changes no matter how great you become. Even if he has a lot of money and a prosperous territory, the fact that he's a commoner doesn't change. In this conversation, Lehana asked if anything happened with the nobles when he went to the capital. He sat down and said it was nothing much, but he noticed it just from the looks. Clearly, they looked at him differently than the others. Lehana asked if he wanted to change that. However, he replied that he was content with his current life and didn't want to stray from his path just to gain a bit more. The hope he had, at least, was that his children would be different. Unlike him, who was content with ruling their remote land, he wanted them to surpass their origins and reach an even higher place. His father realized at that moment that the look in his eyes wasn't one he could change. However, this was the moment he had long dreamed of. His troublesome son had grown up without him even noticing. He then replies that Roman can do as he wishes and ask for any help. He was Roman, son of Dimitri, and that means no matter what he does, he doesn't need to carry the responsibility alone. The scene shifts to a blacksmith. The entire street is extremely busy, with numerous shops. Roman realizes it wasn't a joke when they said they were truly the biggest in the capital. In that place, there are factories where multiple blacksmiths work at the same time. Just this one Dimitri street has 30 blacksmith shops open and functioning. If anyone wants to understand how the Dimitris made so much money, they just need to see this place. The steel mines behind this territory are the largest on the continent, and that's why the blacksmiths can sell equipment at much lower prices. And that's why no noble in the Cairo region dares to be hostile to the Dimitris, not only because of the wealth they possess, but out of fear of losing the equipment they provide. And Roman is already looking for a certain someone. The person who is the symbol of the Dimitri family is considered a master blacksmith. In the conversation, he told his father that he would handle it alone, but he wanted help with the equipment. His father said he would need to speak with Master Hendrik. When it comes to blacksmithing, he was surpassed by Hendrik shortly after becoming a noble. If he says it's a request from Romero himself, he will certainly get everything he needs. However, he had to keep in mind that the Dimitri blacksmiths were extremely proud. They wouldn't be nicer or kinder to him just because he bore the Dimitri name. Only someone who can distinguish the quality of steel and the skill to use it can earn blacksmith's trust. Everyone is staring on the street, and Dimitri realizes it's exactly as his father said. That's to be expected considering the actions of the past Dimitri. In the shop, someone says to take a look at the person who arrived, and Hendrik asks what he's doing there. Roman says he believes his father sent word about his arrival. The blacksmith asks if it's about the equipment for 30 people. The blacksmith says he thought he only said that to steal some items and then sell them because he's out of money. He told him to grab some equipment on the side that was more than enough to arm 30 soldiers. Roman asked if those were the only items available, and the guy said yes. So he then questioned if that was the best Hendrik could do. He said of course not, but if he wasn't satisfied, he should just disappear from that place. But Roman picked up the sword and said that apparently the reputation of the blacksmiths in that place was exaggerated. To think he would call something like that equipment for a soldier. He says he will ask one more time. He wants to know if this is really the best work of Master Hendrik. Hendrik, of course, lashes out at him, saying that the equipment there is of the highest quality in the entire Cairo continent. And the boy who never sweated in front of a forge was trying to judge their work. If it weren't for Romero's request, he wouldn't even receive anything. While his brother worked a long time in the forge to succeed the family, he was covering himself with women in the streets. That means the biggest trash in that place is him and not the swords on the floor. He was just the eldest son who knew nothing and couldn't do anything either. Roman knew he would have to deal with this again. He replied that he understood the reason for the anger. What he wanted to know was why this sword had been hammered so much that it changed color when placed under the sun. This could only have been done by an inexperienced blacksmith who didn't know how to strike the metal. This proves it's not the work of the Dimitris, and the old man cannot deny this fact. He makes a cut with the sword and says that with this, one of his soldiers died on the battlefield because it didn't pierce the flesh. Another soldier had the blade stuck in the enemy's muscle and died with a frightened expression. He asks if that isn't an injustice. He made the best choice on the battlefield but died like trash because he was armed with trash. Hendrik still doesn't know where he's going with this. However, Roman picks up a chainmail from the ground and asks if that is what they call armor. That wouldn't defend against a single attack, not to mention that the weight distribution was all wrong. This means that anyone who trusts in that will die on the battlefield. The organs of soldiers who relied on this chainmail would be torn apart. Dimitri continues to ask what nonsense he is talking about. Roman asks if he really doesn't understand. Roman can understand this guy's frustration since he showed up out of nowhere and started criticizing the equipment. He can accept those thoughts and feelings. However, he crossed the line. He says that if he had really taken that pile of trash from the ground, the soldiers who trusted their lives would have died. Hendrik's feelings couldn't lead to such retaliation. That's because 30 lives were at stake, and even knowing that Hendrik fled from the truth, he asks if someone like that can really be called a craftsman who represents the Dimitri family. Because of personal feelings and this pile of trash, 30 innocent people who did nothing wrong died. His intentions and feelings shouldn't be important. He asked for weapons and armor with his father's name at stake, and the response was to receive this pile of scraps. These actions should be seen as insubordination to his father. He says he knows he's not doing this on purpose, but he needs to understand what his actions represent. Since this wasn't a personal request, but an order from the Lord for him to deliver good weapons and armor, Roman knows that the hierarchy must never become ambiguous. Loyal people, and even those you consider your friends, the moment they cross the imposed limits, they must be severely punished. He says he will ask again if this can be seen as insubordination. Hendrik says, of course not, and Roman then asks why he's trying to deliver that pile of trash. At that moment, other blacksmiths start asking what's going on. They all begin to curse Roman, saying he has no right to come there and humiliate Hendrik. It's even worse that he's holding a sword. They want to know what he's thinking of doing against Hendrik, and immediately, they order him to be stopped. However, Hendrik orders everyone to stand still. The guy asks why, but Hendrik just yells. He turns to Roman and apologizes. The blame was entirely his in this matter. Hendrik remembers when he used to get beaten by his master for trying to make his own swords, who warned him that he would never set foot in that forge again if he intended to do something like that. A little later at home, he was seething with rage at that pig. The guy didn't teach him anything, called himself a master, and just kept beating him every day. That's when he heard someone asking if they were charities by any chance. The guy with the coin in his hand said he knew it wasn't enough for a decent sword. All he wanted was any sword, and he promised to repay much more when he achieved what he wanted. His body wasn't healthy and he needed a weapon to make money. The master replied that he wouldn't deliver it, and the guy kept begging while Hendrik listened to everything. However, the master ordered him to disappear from that place immediately. With that, the guy went back home devastated. However, on the way, Hendrik called out to him. He asked if he really would take that sword for free. Hendrik said yes, and that he heard his situation at the blacksmith's. The guy wanted to pay, but Hendrik responded that it wasn't necessary since he was going to throw it away. He was just happy that the item he made would help someone in some way. The boy thanked him happily, and Hendrik was glad for the first time to have helped someone. However, his expression soon changed when he found the guy dead on the ground. His body was already covered in flies, and seeing that, Hendrik almost vomited. The people around commented that it seemed he had died on a mercenary mission. It seems a bandit tried to strike him with a sword, and when he tried to defend himself, his sword broke. Everyone commented that's why you only go to war if you really have a good weapon. For Hendrik, that wasn't any different than taking his own life. From that day on, he swore he would never let that happen again. But now he was there, old, and almost made the same mistake again. He apologizes and says he will pay the price for his actions. Roman says that if he's willing to take responsibility, then he won't pursue this matter further. He drops the sword and says he knows that Hendrik is one of the best blacksmiths there, so they need to talk business. He's here to get equipment for the soldiers and believes that Hendrik only tried to disobey because of his feelings. But with this, they will bury both their mistakes in the mud. He wants weapons and armor for the soldiers and nothing more. Hendrik realized that Roman had given him a way to escape this without receiving any punishment. What he doesn't understand is how someone can change so much in such a short time. The boy is really not the same as before. And with that, Hendrik swore he would never let something like this happen again. As an apology, the equipment would be made with the best iron available in the Dimitri's possession. And with that, he orders everyone to return to work. And so production begins. While one man sharpens a sword, Roman asks what this business is about him having stolen a sword from Hendrik. The man says that at that time he was drunk and had lost his mind. It seems that 3 years ago, he was drowning in debt, and his father was tired of giving him money. So he snuck in without anyone noticing and stole Hendrik's masterpiece. That sword took 6 months to design and another 3 just to complete without him leaving the forge even for a day. And even so, something so valuable was sold to some random guy for a little money. He would never understand what it means for a blacksmith to lose his masterpiece without it finding its true owner. Roman realizes that his past self really crossed the line. At that moment, Hendrik calls him over and says he doesn't forgive him for the things that happened. He is making the request because he was wrong at the beginning, but he doesn't accept a Dimitri's son who knows nothing about blacksmithing. He had to keep in mind that the foundation of that place was the forge. If one day he made something with his own hands that wasn't trash, then he would see him differently. Roman responds that it won't take long. And with that, he returns to the same secluded room where he trained his skeletal body. Everything was organized exactly as he had requested. All the tools were available. And now, it was time to start. When he was back, it was at 18 years old that he decided to forge his own blade. When everyone was deciding who would be the successor of the demon cult, he was constantly attacked by his brothers. He was attacked by number 11 one night and almost lost his life. He barely survived, but the sword couldn't withstand the attacks. Even so, his brother gave him no chance to escape. He somehow managed to win that duel with a broken blade, but narrowly escaped death. However, that's when he discovered he would need a sword made just for him. From that moment on, he visited blacksmiths every day to learn how to forge from them. Since then, before a decisive battle, he always forged a new sword for his current self. After thousands of battles, the sword changed little by little, and the 39th one was named the Celestial Demon Sword, a treasure so rare that it was impossible to sell at any price. And now for this upcoming war, it was time to make a sword for his new self. And with that, Roman began to work. He had repeated these actions thousands of times. and understood the rhythm and strength needed, the concentration required to focus on a single objective. To forge something like this, you needed to be in a trance. While forging, he asked himself what he was living for. In that world, he was forced to survive because he was born as the son of the celestial demon, and battles fell upon him. However, he never saw this as a bad thing, and at this moment his mind is the same and he will remain true to his reality. However, this life he now leads doesn't necessarily mean he has to go against everyone, and this shows that his training needs to be even firmer. This only shows that he still has no idea of the most powerful forces in this world. Defeat could not be tolerated. He then makes a breath of flames. That was the art of the infernal demon. It transformed all accumulated mana into heat. Even though it wasn't the best that existed, it was the only one this weaker self could use. He couldn't forge many things because his organs would be damaged. However, he desired a power that could face all variables. Back at the Lawrence mansion, Flora says that at this moment they are trapped and out of options. Aid had been cut off and the military difference was clear. She heard the discussion about surrendering to preserve what little land the family had left. However, she believes that's the one thing they absolutely shouldn't do. Suddenly, Lawrence slams the table. He says that preserving the soldiers' lives is the best choice in this war. But Flora said that the Barcos had taken a lot of money from the central government, and everyone knew it was a loan without collateral. That means it has an extremely high interest rate. This is only possible because the Barcos aren't the only ones who will benefit from this war. The bank lent this money to receive part of what they would conquer. This means that all this land will be completely consumed once they occupy it. Everyone falls silent, realizing that surrender was not an option. And her father asks what they should do then. She says there's only one way out. They would have to resist desperately. That was the only way they could survive. Her father slammed the table at the thought of a resistance. For a moment, he had some expectations about what she was going to say. He thought that maybe she would have the discernment to see through the situation and come up with an incredible plan. But in the end, it was just common sense. He then asked if the incredible plan she was thinking of was, for example, closing the gates. She said she wasn't talking about hiding. They would have to set fire to all the crops of that year and stockpile as much food as possible to withstand the siege until winter came. Her father asked why that would be important. She replied that it would be enough time for the interest on the loans to start accumulating. The gold bank had massive power and influence across the entire continent. If the war didn't end quickly, they would start pressuring the Barcos to finish it faster. This wouldn't happen because the gold bank could be pressured by the central government's connection, but because they would hire mercenaries who are only motivated by the money that comes from that bank. Once winter began, having a castle would no longer be advantageous, and the mercenaries themselves would start leaving that place. The people began to comment that it would be a battle of time, but it was something plausible. And Lawrence was thinking that he had raised his daughter to be very immature in the end. But she had changed a lot. He slammed the table. He said Flora was right, so they would start preparing for desperate resistance. They would keep surviving and keep the Lawrence lineage alive. Even if the walls fell and the castle was destroyed, they would continue trying to survive until the end. Back to Roman, the first sword seemed ready, and he said that no matter what, the first time for anyone and anything is always special. This was his first sword in this life, one that would fit perfectly with who he was now, and the name would be borrowed from this world. It would be called Salamandra. The scene then shifts to someone approaching. From the wall of the Lawrence castle, it's a man carrying the Barco family's crest, and up on the wall, the soldiers are all scared. The man announces that as a messenger of the Barcos, he came here with 3 options. If they lowered the gates and surrendered, their lives would be spared. The second option is that they leave these walls and come for a fair fight on the battlefield. There would be a judge from the central government, and they could choose 2 knights to participate. They could choose the type of battle, and the Barcos would accept the decision. Roman just observed, and said they don't trust the Barcos. The war proclamation was not justified as the ancestral document had been forged, and they also had no intention of sacrificing the lives of the Lawrence people. While the Viscount said he would never give up, the soldier said the last option was to abandon their pride as a noble family member and proceed with the desperate measure of resisting within the castle. He then turned and said that the Barco family understood their wishes, and that they would exact the price for the blood that would be shed in this siege. On the wall, the soldiers were trembling, and Lawrence was frightened. The war had already begun. He immediately ordered the archers to fire. The first arrows were shot, and the Lawrence army was already advancing. It was classic medieval warfare, face to face. Meanwhile, someone was throwing their helmet to the ground. It was the Barcos who were furious with these insolent people for not respecting them. They had prepared 3 times more soldiers, so why weren't they surrendering? The soldier behind expected it to be decided in an hour, but the pace of the battle was quite different. The man replied to the lord that the Lawrences seemed prepared to stretch this fight. They had dug around the entire wall and given access to the river so the soldiers couldn't get close. And from the number of arrows fired, it was clear they had enough war supplies. The leader couldn't understand why these damn people chose to resist desperately in just 1 week. They had calculated everything perfectly so that they would simply surrender. So why were they risking locking themselves inside this gate? He couldn't understand where the plan went wrong. The knight asked the lord what they would do. The man said it was obvious. They would use that. The man trembled and said he understood. The man smiled and said that Lawrence was not a person with a very strong mind. After all, he sold his daughter to the Dimitris when he felt the pressure from the Barcos. He is the type of man who shrinks when a crisis begins. But on the wall, he was telling everyone to move. They should prepare again because it was impossible to know when the Barcos would attack again. And the father told Flora that she was right. The Barcos attacked just to make them surrender, but as soon as they saw the resistance, they retreated. She says she realized that she herself had to become stronger, instead of waiting for problems to be solved. This was the path in life that she decided to follow from now on. Her father was moved and apologized for forcing her to marry the Dimitris. To him, at that time, it was the only way they could survive. However, from now on, he will always believe that she will be able to make a good choice. Flora was very emotional, but then her expression changed. Suddenly, the wall in front of them exploded. A single attack had torn apart the front section. She went to check how this was possible, and there she saw that the Barcos had a catapult armed with magic. Flare was a well-known item in wars. These were called magical weapons. Each shot with that thing is extremely expensive and should be used strategically. Not to mention that it cannot be used without government permission, no matter how much money someone has. She never imagined that the Barcos would have the resources and connections for this. And the worst part is that there are only two ways to defeat a flare. Either you use another magical weapon of the same rank, or they would have to leave the castle and destroy it. The problem is that both options were impossible. But of course they didn't want to give up just like that. At that moment, a maid announced that they had received a magical message. This wasn't just a very rare means of communication, but also very expensive. The maid said that Roman Dimitri had said he had a way to help, so she should accept the offer. Flora had no idea. Why was Roman Dimitri getting involved in this? The scene then shifts to her asking how he plans to save the Lawrences from danger. Roman says he will make it clear that he's only doing this to get revenge on the Barcos for personal reasons. It's something he had already decided on, and this is the perfect time for revenge. If the Lawrences follow his plan, he will actively participate and destroy the Barco family for them. She asks what they will have to do in this plan. He says the Lawrences will first have to create a stage for him by making a certain sacrifice. If they create this with all the forces he has, Roman Dimitri will help. This sacrifice he mentioned. She knows he proposed this due to the situation they find themselves in, so she had no other choice. She says she will do whatever he asks since it means protecting her family. He then says he needs one more thing. He will need a reason to get involved in this war. The engagement was canceled, so he needs something else. She asks what he needs, and Roman tells her to tell everyone that Anthony Barco abused her at one of the meetings. That was the reason why she couldn't see herself in a marriage after that happened. Her value as a noble would be reduced to nothing, and the beauty of her title as the flower of the Lawrences would be destroyed. But if she gave up everything she received by being born a noble, she would gain a crucial cause that would solve the Lawrence problem. This is the cause he needs to get involved in this war. Flora trembled. He says that if this happened before they canceled the engagement, it would be reason enough. Since then, he would have laid hands on someone who belonged to him, and he would never forgive that. Flora thought about what he said about the people who belonged to him, while remembering the explosions happening outside. There the soldiers were screaming and being burned. The walls were already collapsing, and they needed support. With a trembling voice, she said she would meet any condition he set, and just asked him to kill all those Barco bastards. The enemy was beginning to scale the walls, and Lawrence gave the order for them to defend and keep resisting. But at that moment, a hooded man appeared and lunged to take Lawrence's life. He saw that he wouldn't be able to dodge in time, but then he was struck in the face. Flora had shot an arrow. Her father turned and asked what she was doing there, but she only said that they would have to open the gates and face the Barcos head-on, and he asked why she was saying that. She explained that Roman had promised that he would help them. As the troops entered the castle, they would destroy the flare. Her father asked why Dimitri had changed his mind now. She said there was no time to explain, but she was sure. He was a man who kept his word. In another place in the forest, Roman was observing a magic crystal, when Chris approached and asked if they would attack already. But Roman replied that they wouldn't. Chris said that at this rate, the Lawrences would be defeated before they got involved. The flare was an extremely powerful weapon that would destroy that wall. They needed to launch this attack at this very moment, but Roman just asked why he would do that. Whether the Lawrences fell or not was of no importance to him. He then told Chris to pay attention. Among the deaths of hundreds of people he doesn't know, ensuring that none of them shed blood is much more important. The Lawrences would indeed lose a lot of people because of this, but that's their fault for following a lord who lacks capability. However, unlike them, those who follow him would not become meaningless sacrifices. Chris simply responded that he understood, but he had no idea how the guy could make such a choice. At that moment, the Lawrences gave the order for the gates to be opened, and they commanded their soldiers to move forward. The army from the ships began entering the castle, and the Lawrences were there waiting for them. A man with a red beard smiled and said they didn't know their place, and the guy made a slash that split the poor fellow in two. That was the Burge mercenary company. The first one to fall to the ground was already screaming and begging for help. The troops started moving forward, but everyone knew they were marching to their deaths. From the wall, Flora continued giving orders for them to resist until the end and not retreat. She knew that if they didn't even serve as a trap, he wouldn't appear. However, suddenly the sounds of horse hooves were heard. Someone was approaching from the rear of the base, and the leader asked who they were. Obviously, it was Roman's personal cavalry arriving. For him, the moment for the soldiers to risk their lives had come too soon. He knew that most were insecure and anxious at that moment, but this was the reality they would have to face. And he promised that whoever survived would live the life of a predator. However, in the end, it was each person's individual skill that determined who came out alive. He warned everyone that the priority was to reach the base of the ships and destroy the siege weapon. He knew the Lawrences would be insufficient to create a good distraction, and he didn't expect much from the soldiers either. That's why he would be the one leading the vanguard. He was going to massacre everyone in front of him and clear the path for them to just deal with the rest. But they had to keep something in mind. The priority was to destroy the siege. The captain, seeing this, thought they were a bunch of idiots thinking they could win with so few soldiers, and he warned his men to prepare to take down these crazy guests. The knights raised their shields and spears, and Roman went head-to-head against them. He approached and raised his blade against them all. He threw himself into the middle of the barricade and cut down the first ones. His horse was killed, but the Muram world always followed one rule. The celestial demon was always at the forefront of the demonic cult, because he himself was supposed to be the invincible unit, and anyone who faced him was destined to lose their life. What everyone wondered was why he stayed in the most dangerous position, even though he was the most valuable person. In the past and present, the reason was always the same. Having someone so powerful at the front crushed the enemy's morale, and Roman announced that if no one came forward, he would wipe them all out. Kevin then shouted for everyone to follow the leader. With that, they went on a rampage. However, Kevin's course was hit, but that only made him angrier. He wanted to keep following Roman, and for that reason, he didn't hesitate and finished the guy off right there. Chris remained focused. All he wanted was not to stray too far from Roman so he could support him, and the soldiers made a barricade, saying they had to stop this monster. But they stood no chance, and Roman knew very well what the target of that operation was. The weapon known as Flare. The leader of the mercenaries named Burge recognized Roman Dimitri. He knew that in this mission, his mercenaries would receive a huge reward, and seeing what was happening, you would have to deal with that guy. Roman already knew that Burge was a rank mercenary, someone recognized by the kingdom itself, and unlike the others, he was a soldier who knew how to use mana. Burge was an aura knight at least 2 stars. However, he was shocked to see that Roman didn't retreat even for a second under his attack. The boy's blade was already surrounded by a purple energy, and man, he struck the guy full on. Burge managed to defend himself but realized Roman was too strong. With that, he started retreating, trying to protect himself. But the slash went through, and it took 5 seconds for him to fall to his knees. That was the amount of time the rank of mercenary could resist against Roman. The enemies were terrified to see the captain die like that. All the allies were all ecstatic. The leader of the ships ordered everyone to kill that bastard, but he was just thrashing about and the men said it was too dangerous. Roman was curious about something else. This weapon called Flare, the product of something that didn't exist in the Muram world. He then activated the art of the heavenly demon. That was the first form of the sword technique, and with that he tore Flare in half. The soldiers of the ship realized they stood no chance. The expensive item they had brought had been destroyed. Roman called out to the Lawrences and said that he would destroy the siege weapon. He had destroyed the Barco's siege weapon. From the wall, the people were cheering, but there was someone more emotional than anyone else. It was, of course, Flora, impressed that he had said it and then done it. To her, it was clear that with the destruction of the flare, the Barcos had no choice but to retreat. In that battle, Chris had used his aura differently than before. Instead of trying to make the energy explode, he tried to keep it condensed like Roman. Some friends had ridiculed him when he left everything behind to follow that man, but unlike them, he was growing. Even if he wanted to deny it now, it was impossible. The method his lord followed was the correct one. However, then he became confused. His friends were all lying on the ground, exhausted and worn out. But the most incredible thing was that they had all made the effort to follow the leader. Yet the amazing part was that none of the 30 had even been injured. And strangely, the 30 people he had chosen were the right ones. And there was only one reason why all of them were safe. The person who had gone ahead and defied logic. Roman approached and said they had done well to survive. Their role in this was now over. The Lawrence gates were then lowered, and the Dimitri army entered the castle. Of course, everyone shouted his name, shouting that he was the hero who had saved all of Lawrence's territory. The Viscount couldn't help but feel ashamed. He knew he wasn't capable, but the boy had gone ahead and done everything he needed by himself. That was truly destructive talent. Romero had raised a terrifying tiger, and if he had made any mistakes, that man would have been his son-in-law. It was a pity, but that was the past. He then called out to Dimitri and said that he was also the hero of that place. He thanked him for his presence and said it was a pleasure to see him there. Ronan simply smiled and shook hands while the people cheered. He entered the castle and was about to go into a room when someone asked him to wait. It was, of course, Flora who wanted to thank him. She said she knew they hadn't fulfilled their role as bait properly, but even so, he hadn't abandoned them in the end. So she wanted to thank him from the bottom of her heart. Ronan simply replied that he had fulfilled his part as promised. The Lawrences had done as much as he expected them to do. Flora said she wanted to repay this favor no matter what. She didn't want to just offer words of gratitude. So whenever he wanted, all he had to do is ask, and he would receive it during his conference. She would stand by his side and ensure that he received whatever it was. Then he smiled and said that if she really wanted to return the favor, he wouldn't refuse. He opened the door and told them to enter the conference room. He sat in the chair and listened to the conversation between the nobles. Their plan was to propose ending the war with the Barcos because they would accept it. This was because the Barcos still had many soldiers, and they would only take risks by advancing. The best plan was to abandon the past and seek peace. All Roman could think of was that he was in the herbivore's room. The Viscount agreed and said that they really didn't have enough strength to continue resisting the Barcos' attacks. They would send a messenger. At that moment, Roman asked if he could give his opinion. Everyone fell silent. He received permission and thanked them. He then explained that the Barcos were now under financial pressure. They would have to pay the cost of this attack and still return the money to those they had borrowed from. If they sent a messenger asking them to surrender, all they would receive is his head back. The people hadn't thought of the obvious. Now that the Barcos are cornered, they won't retreat. Roman said that the soldiers outside were still carrying bodies and questioned whether anyone had felt anything witnessing that. The Barcos should not be forgiven, and they needed to show this to everyone. This was their chance to show the world what happens to those who decide to attack the Lawrences. The Viscount said he knew that, but what would they do if they didn't have the strength? Roman said that there was only one way to finish them. The Viscount felt cornered. To Roman, a herbivore had no choice but to become the prey of a savage. Meanwhile, on the Barcos side, someone was shouting. It was the captain banging on the table, asking why the damned Roman got involved in this war. A large-scale attack would be too disadvantageous. Now he only had one option left: a one-on-one combat. Each family would send a representative, and the central government would appoint a judge to oversee everything. A true duel of warriors. The Viscount said that warrior battles had already deteriorated due to connections and money. The Barcos, despite being affected, still had a lot of money and connections with the government. It was unpredictable which master they would call to participate in something like that. Roman said he understood what he was saying, and that's why he would provide the certainty he was seeking. The room fell silent, and the Viscount was confused, asking what certainty he would deliver. Roman said that the certainty that a warrior's battle would be the best option. The Barcos have a 3-star knight, and he is probably the one who will fight. He would represent the Lawrences and fight for them. He was certain he could guarantee at least one victory regardless of who the Barcos sent. The problem was that it wouldn't matter if he won one and they lost two. So their subordinate, named Chris, would participate in the final battle. He was a genius who could defeat even a 3-star opponent. If they emerged victorious in this combat, the entire reputation of the Lawrences would be resurrected. He looked at Flora and told everyone to make their decision. That's when she remembered the conversation they had before entering. Apparently, this was the favor he wanted to ask. She could understand the implications. He would take on the role of defending them, but the Lawrences would have to deal with any unknown variables. She was only afraid of what this would lead to because she felt that man was very dangerous. But now she couldn't go back on her word, so she said she was in favor of this combat. Soon after, the agreement was made by both parties, and everything was organized for a week later. Now things moved forward. A man introduced himself as Count Eretz and said that the warriors' battle was an event blessed by Valhalla. Both sides would have to accept all the rules, and anyone who broke the rules of this combat would be attacked by the entire kingdom of Cairo. He then ordered both sides to submit their list of warriors. At another table, someone poured a glass of wine. Roman was just observing the calmness of the Barcos. He soon noticed something and warned Lawrence that they would have to change the order of the combat. He was a bit startled since this had been decided a week ago, but he said the problem was this past week itself. He thought the Barcos were afraid of paying more interest, but the truth was they had delayed this on purpose. He knew something was wrong because those guys weren't anxious at all. Lawrence said that apparently they must have called in a great master then. And nearby there was a man about to pass out from drinking and dying of sleepiness. But Roman noticed something different about him, and the Viscount asked what he wanted to do. Ronan's plan was to win the first, lose the second, and have Chris win the last. But now he decided to change it and said that Chris would go first. Both father and daughter were startled. He said he would go second and face the card the Barcos had prepared. He would modify the plan to make it overwhelming. The audience was all anxious, and Chris was already in the arena, facing his opponent. The man introduced himself as Jansen of the Barcos, a 3-star knight. Chris also introduced himself and said that today he represented the Lawrences. Everyone in the audience recognized the name of the 2-star knight and knew that now a talented person would die for no reason. But Chris was certain that to become stronger, risks had to be taken. That was the reason he had left the pit. He was in to follow his lord. The flag was raised with the order for the duel to begin. Immediately the two moved, and Jansen went straight for a mana slash. But there was something Chris had learned in his first duel with Roman. Aura is irrelevant until it touches the opponent's body. As long as he wasn't hit, the guy's 3 stars were irrelevant. He needed to keep dodging until he found an opportunity. Jansen kept slashing and asking how long this rat would keep dodging. He lunged forward and told him to die. Chris realized that the guy had expanded his entire aura across the field. It was something he couldn't dodge, so what would he do? But then he remembered that Roman had told him to distance himself from the logic that others followed. And then he remembered one detail. A meaningless explosion of mana doesn't show the true potential of an aura. The entire movement of the attack should follow a single direction, and the whole power of the aura should be concentrated on a single point. The two faced each other at the moment of the final blow, and Chris's concentrated aura sliced the man's in half. The stump just fell to the ground, and the entire crowd immediately shouted his name. To them, it was surreal for a 2-star knight to defeat a 3-star one, while Roman was just smiling, the ones obviously trembling with Barcos. Their plan was to end it all in the second fight, but now the final had become the most important one. But they didn't care since they didn't mean to worry about the second match. After all, they had a guarantee in the person they had spent a fortune on. The blue-haired man asked if it was his turn. He went to the arena and yawned, dying of boredom. He then introduced himself as Homeros, representing the Barcos. A 4-star knight, everyone there was shocked. Homeros was a well-known name in the region. This guy was in the rankings of the best. So what was he doing in this small town? He was currently considered number 49 in the most powerful people on the continent. The ranking system originated from the Valhalla Empire, the place where warriors believe they are sent after combat. Because of this, the results of the victors were always recorded, and the names of the powerful were always remembered. That's how the rankings were restarted. And as the Valhalla Empire began to dominate all the continents, the temple began to rank the top 100 strongest. Now the Viscount was certain that there was no way to win this second fight. There wasn't a single person in all of Cairo who hadn't heard that name. Everyone knew that this man roamed the continent, defeating everyone. He was known as the Wandering Swordsman, and now it was clear that this second battle wasn't even worth watching. It was even a pity for the Lawrences to have to face this. However, someone was obviously smiling. Roman was excited about the fact that the man was a 4-star knight. He tried to gather information about who the Barcos would send, but it was all superficial. That man in front of them was the trump card the Barcos had been hiding. But he was eager for this. Just as they had hidden their strength, they had no idea how powerful he was. However, Flora grabbed his arm and told him that he had to surrender. His opponent was ranked 49th, not to mention that he was young enough to reach the 30s or even higher. She told him to stop dreaming of defeating someone from the rankings because otherwise, he would lose his life. All they should do was pray that they could win the next fight. Homeros was just watching, and Roman knew that was how someone who felt absolute looked at others. And it was something he obviously didn't like. Flora said this was the unpredictable situation they had talked about, so she would send their soldier. There was no reason for him to risk his life in a meaningless battle. But of course, Roman simply pulled her hand away. He said he had no intention of explaining the details, so she shouldn't bother him. He then presented himself on the battlefield. As Roman of Dimitri, defending the Lawrences, the two drew their swords, and Homeros knew that if the guy had destroyed a flare, he was at least a 2-star knight. To him, it was ridiculous to have to face someone like that, especially since he would soon be competing for the 30th rank. So he decided to finish it quickly. In a second, he lunged at Roman, and the soldiers around noticed how fast that movement was. Roman defended against the attack, but the blade came extremely close to his neck. As soon as the block was made, the man was already behind him. Homeros was even excited, saying that the boy was interesting. He slashed again, and Roman defended while condensing all of his mana into the blade. Homeros, intrigued, asked why he was manifesting aura that way, while Roman was getting angry because that man was clearly underestimating him. Tired of it, Homeros activated his 3-star aura and said he would face him seriously. The energy began to generate electricity throughout the arena, and the people in the audience were even having to hold on. But Roman was thrilled to know that this guy was ranked 49th. To him, there was no reason to drag out this fight any longer. He then stepped forward, activated his aura, and told the man to resist it if he could. The celestial demon techniques have no form. All Homeros could see was a sudden black wave in front of him. He didn't even know that something like that could be created with mana. Indeed, the attack had no form, and that's why the moves were only identified by numbers. And that was known as the third move. We saw the noble trying to convince Homeros to participate in this duel and give up the fight with that Fernando ranked 30th. It was his guild leader saying they would receive a lot of money if he participated in this duel between two remote families. He thought about it, realizing he had refused all missions since becoming a rank A, so maybe it was worth it. Since he needed money as well, he decided not to refuse. But the result was completely different. Everyone there was speechless, and in the audience, they couldn't even understand what happened. The prodigy of Kiro, who had entered the rankings even before becoming a 4-star, had been killed with a single slash. Roman didn't understand how someone so far from their peak could be so arrogant. That's because his metrics weren't based on this world, but on the one he came from. Compared to this place, the world of Murim was like a galaxy of martial masters. No one dared to be arrogant since death always took the careless. To Roman, this place was inefficient, and he then told the judge to announce the winner of the second combat. Hesitant and stumbling over his words, he said that the winner was Roman Dimitri for the House of Lawrence. The people couldn't believe that the prodigy everyone talked about was really dead. To them, it was like a hallucination, and it was only then that Chris realized the true strength of the lore he followed. He didn't understand if he had been this strong in the first duel or if he had changed drastically afterward. He was certain that he hadn't been so powerful as to defeat Homeros back then. So how could this be explained logically? As soon as he defeated Jansen, he thought that the day he would defeat Roman wasn't so far off. But that was pure foolishness. The flag was raised declaring that the House of Lawrence had won. With that, the last fight was irrelevant and it didn't matter who was sent. Aretes announced that both families could send another warrior. The Barco representative was seething with rage. It was over now, but he couldn't understand how Homeros had died. He wasn't just an average knight to the warriors of the north. He was one of the few true soldiers in the kingdom of Cairo. So why are the mercenaries sent to fake Homeros? The man asked who they would send now, but the Barco representative simply said that they couldn't afford to lose any more strength. He then told them to just send Benson. The man was shocked. He knew this was revenge for the shame Benson had brought upon them when he was beaten by Dimitri. The problem was that Benson was a knight with no stars, so he was being sent to die. But he had no choice, so he simply said he understood. Benson presented himself on the battlefield, trembling all over. No one in the audience had ever heard of this name, but Chris knew very well who this man was. Someone suddenly stepped in front of Roman. It was Kevin, who said he would face that man. To Roman, in a world where the strongest survive, the only thing given to losers is death. Even if Benson was a starless knight, it would still be very difficult for Kevin. He knew the boy was trying to prove he was useful in some way, and if that was the case, he gave him permission. Kevin then said he would be back soon. On the field, Benson was wondering how he had ended up in this mess. He had only decided to become a knight for the Barcos, because his father had no problem doing so either. That was the reason he had chosen an influential family where he would only make money. But even so, he had always been loyal, and now he was being sent to die like trash. But something confused him. He wondered if that boy would be his opponent. Now his expression changed and he thanked God. They then faced each other, and Benson couldn't contain his laughter. He asked Kevin if he had come to seek revenge for that day. Regardless of what it was, both had been abandoned by their lords. But to Benson, this meant he was incredibly lucky. Kevin simply replied that he was nothing more than a sword that protected his lord, and Benson immediately lunged at him, telling him to stop being arrogant. Kevin barely dodged the first attack, and immediately retaliated, aiming for Benson's neck. Benson managed to tilt his chin back just in time, and landed a kick, sending Kevin to the ground. Kevin's helmet was knocked off, and the boy slid across the arena. He stood up, not in the best condition. Chris realized that the problem here was the difference in physical strength, as Benson was an adult, and he couldn't understand what Roman was thinking by letting Kevin participate in this. Once again, Kevin took a hit to the chest armor, and only didn't lose his arm because the blacksmith had done a good job. Kevin was being humiliated, but little by little, something was building up inside him. A voice in his head told him to kill that man. That was the bastard who had hurt him, and it was time for revenge. He remembered that Roman had explained that from the moment he cut his hand, the art of the spiritual demon had been implanted in his mind. All he had to do was bring this demon out. And suddenly, something strange began to happen to Kevin. A strange dark aura appeared around his body. He was about to take a blow to the head when a strange voice told him to look up. He barely dodged that strike. He stood up and faced Benson. The voice laughed at him for almost getting cut in half and said it was time to tear that man apart. Kevin couldn't understand why there was a voice screaming at him. What he wanted was to be useful to his lord. He wanted to be more useful than Chris. He hated the feeling of inferiority, and those emotions began to create a vortex of rage. That was the art of the spiritual demon. And the moment the voice told him to kill that man, he, in a second, lunged at Benson. Benson immediately recognized that the tip of Kevin's blade was coated with aura. He knew that it would penetrate his armor. So he raised his blade and called the boy a bastard. He landed a solid hit on Kevin's shoulder, but Kevin didn't back down. Benson couldn't understand why this boy wasn't retreating. It was as if he had lost his mind. And with that, the attack went through. Both Chris and the audience were horrified. The boy seemed to be enjoying killing that man, and he continued striking his body. The battlefield was drenched in blood, and Kevin was there in the middle, laughing like a madman. He then left the arena. He approached Roman and said he had returned as promised. Roman simply replied that he had done an excellent job. The boy, now like a joker, was smiling happily. The duel ended with 3 victories for the Lawrences, and at the center of it all was Roman Dimitri. Just as a hero's story is passed down from generation to generation, the rumors of that battle were wrapped in both truths and lies. The bars were all talking about it. The Barcos must have been extremely frustrated at having lost to the Lawrences after gathering so many people. And now, everyone was even fighting to claim that they had relatives living with the Lawrences. To everyone, Roman was seen as the savior of those lands. Everyone knew that he had massacred the enemy army and even destroyed the flare with a single attack. Not only did he prevent the Lawrences from being defeated, but he also cut the 49th ranked knight in half. To the children of the Lawrence kingdom, Roman was like a hero. And now the first tales of the Dragon of Dimitri were beginning to accumulate. The scene shifts to the Barco castle. With 1,000,000 papers piled up, they knew it was the end. There was no escaping from the mountain of loans they had taken, the interest letters piling up from the gold bank and the messages from the mercenaries because of Homero's death. He was furious with all these bastards, Before, all the nobles wanted to get close to the Barcos, but now, everyone was pretending he didn't exist. None of this would have happened if that damn Dimitri hadn't gotten involved. To him, it was really Roman's fault for doing something that shouldn't be done in an aristocracy. He had found the only chance to save the Barco family. A few days later, at a meeting, he thanked all the nobles who had decided to attend. He started talking about the future of the North, but everyone just told him to stop stalling. He then said he would talk about the Barcos' attack on the Lawrence castle, which had a valid cause. And a valid cause is extremely important in an aristocracy. This cause had been approved by the central government and all the involved judges. But Roman Dimitri participated in this without any logical reason. And even the final duel, none of the Lawrences participated. He slammed the table, asking what the logical reason was for Roman Dimitri to have helped those people. This would only make sense if that marriage had gone through. But at the current moment, Roman is nothing to the Lawrences, and his actions go against aristocracy and nobility. Everyone at the table started saying that indeed he had no cause, and the Barco leader smiled, thinking this should be enough. He planned to shift the blame onto the Dimitris, who would have to pay the gold bank and thus nullify his debts. But at that moment, he heard a commotion outside, and Roman Dimitri himself appeared at the meeting. He said he knew they would have complaints about him, and that's why he came. The Barco leader didn't understand why he had come in person, but Roman responded that he came in person to see the like on this video that helps Mamoru make more juicy content for his viewers, activate the cheeky little bell, and I'm out.